A 12-year-old girl walks into a motorcycle clubhouse holding photographs that could get her killed. She doesn't know the men in the white van have already learned her name. She doesn't know the scarred biker standing in front of her once watched her father bleed out on a dirt road 6,000 miles from home and carried the debt ever since. She doesn't know that by the end of this week, an entire outlaw brotherhood will go to war. Not for territory, not for money, but to keep one child breathing. This is a story about the people who stand guard when the rest of the world looks away. Stay with me until the very end. If this story hits you, drop a like, leave a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. Let's ride. The camera was broken before Ava Hargrove ever touched it. Cracked lens, scratched body, a dent along the top plate where something heavy had struck the metal hard enough to leave a permanent scar. Her father had carried it through 2 deployments, 3 field hospitals, and a military funeral that never happened because they sent him home breathing but incomplete. The camera sat in a shoebox under his bed for 2 years before Ava found it. She was 10 then. She didn't ask permission. She just took it, loaded film she bought with lunch money she'd saved for 3 weeks, and started shooting. Now she was 12, and the camera still worked the same way her father did, damaged, unreliable, but somehow still capturing things nobody else could see. Millbrook, Virginia sat 40 minutes south of nothing important, a town built on a trucking corridor that dried up in the 90s and never recovered. Gas stations outnumbered grocery stores. The high school football field had better lighting than the emergency room. And on the east side, where the pavement cracked and the streetlights flickered like dying heartbeats, a row of low brick buildings housed the kind of businesses that survived on cash and silence. A pawn shop, a laundromat with 3 working machines, a convenience store called Dell's that sold cigarettes to minors and coffee that tasted like battery acid. Ava sat on the curb outside Dell's every afternoon from 3:30 until dark. She photographed everything: stray dogs limping through parking lots, old men counting change on bus benches, the way puddles reflected neon signs at angles that turned the ugly world beautiful for exactly 1 frame. Nobody paid attention to a skinny girl with a broken camera. That was the point. Her mother, Sarah Hargrove, worked double shifts at the regional medical center 22 miles west. She left the house before Ava woke up. She came home after Ava fell asleep. On the refrigerator, a handwritten note read, "Dinner in the microwave. Lock the doors. I love you." The same note. Every night, the handwriting getting shakier each month. Sarah was 34 and looked 48. She had the posture of someone who had been carrying weight so long her spine forgot what straight felt like. Ava never complained. She learned early that complaining required an audience, and audiences cost energy her mother didn't have. The Iron King's clubhouse sat 3 blocks east of Dell's, behind a rusted chain-link fence and a hand-painted sign that read, "No visitors," in letters large enough to read from the street. The building was a converted auto body shop. Concrete floors, steel roll-up doors, fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects. Motorcycles lined the front lot in neat rows. Harleys, mostly. A few older Indians. Chrome catching whatever light the sky offered. The smell of engine oil and exhaust hung permanently in the air like weather. Ava had photographed the clubhouse dozens of times. Never the men. Just the bikes, the shadows, the way the garage lights spilled across wet asphalt at night. She understood boundaries the way feral animals understand fences, instinctively, without needing the lesson explained. But she noticed things. She noticed the Tuesday evening the white van first appeared. It was early January, temperature dropping below 20, wind cutting through her jacket like the fabric wasn't there. She was shooting the neon reflection of Dell's sign in a frozen puddle when the van rolled past. Slow. Too slow for someone who knew where they were going. Dented rear door, Virginia plates, 2 men in front. The passenger had his window cracked despite the cold, and he was watching the Iron King's lot the way a man watches something he plans to take apart. Ava didn't think about it consciously. Her thumb just pressed the shutter. 3 days later, the van came back. Same dent, different plates. This time, Maryland tags. Same slow crawl past the clubhouse. Same passenger with the cracked window. Ava was sitting in the same spot, and some part of her brain, the part that cataloged patterns the way other kids cataloged baseball cards, lit up with a signal she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. She shot 6 frames. The van, the plates, the passenger's profile through the dirty glass. By the third pass, 6 days after the first, the plates were from North Carolina. And the van didn't just pass, it stopped. 60 seconds. Engine idling. The passenger lifted something that caught the dying light, binoculars or a phone camera, Ava couldn't tell, and aimed it directly at the Iron King's front gate. Then it pulled away. Slow, patient, like something practicing. Ava sat on the frozen curb with her heart beating faster than it should have been and her fingers going numb around the camera body. She didn't know what she'd documented. She didn't know the word reconnaissance. She didn't understand that the men in the van were part of a theft operation that had already stripped 14 motorcycle clubs across 5 states, stealing bikes worth tens of thousands and funneling them through chop shops that operated out of rented warehouses along the I-81 corridor. She just knew something was wrong. The way you know a sound in a dark house is wrong, not because you understand the threat, because your body does. She developed the photos that night in the school darkroom she'd convinced Mr. Paulson to let her use after hours. The images came up grainy, imperfect, beautiful in the way that accidental truth always is. The van, the plates changing, the passenger's half-visible face, a timeline of surveillance that even a tired cop would have to take seriously. Ava stared at the photos drying on the line and made a decision that would change everything. She could have shown them to her mother. But Sarah would panic, call the police, and the police in Millbrook responded to things like this the way they responded to everything. Slowly, skeptically, and with the quiet assumption that people on the east side of town were probably involved in whatever trouble found them. She could have ignored it, let whatever was going to happen, happen. Walk away. Stay invisible. Instead, she walked 3 blocks east in 18-degree weather with the photographs inside her jacket, pushed open the chain-link gate beneath the no visitors sign, and stepped onto Iron King's ground. The garage was open. Warm air carrying oil fumes rolled out across the lot like breath. Inside, 4 men stood around a bike on a lift, a heritage Softail with a blown gasket, based on the parts spread across the floor. They wore leather cuts with the Iron King's patch on the back, a crowned skull over crossed wrenches, no bottom rocker, no state claim. An independent club. Old school. The closest man turned when her boots scraped the concrete. He was maybe 50. Beard like steel wool. Hands wrapped in shop rags stained the color of old blood. His name was Dutch, though Ava didn't know that yet. He looked at her like she'd walked into the wrong building. "You lost?" "No, sir. This ain't a place for kids." "I know." The silence stretched. The other men stopped what they were doing. One of them, a younger guy with a shaved head and a prosthetic hand he didn't bother hiding, leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms. His name was Colt, and he'd lost the hand to an IED outside Fallujah 7 years ago and never once talked about it. "I need to talk to whoever's in charge," Ava said. Her voice didn't shake. She'd practiced that. Dutch almost smiled. Almost. "In charge of what?" "In charge of these bikes." She looked at the row of Harleys outside. "Because somebody's watching them, and I don't think you know." The silence changed texture. It went from dismissive to something heavier, something colder. Dutch looked at Colt. Colt looked toward the back of the garage, where a door led to a room that used to be the shop office and now served as the Iron King's chapel, the room where votes happened, debts were settled, and the club decided who lived inside their protection and who didn't. "Wait here," Dutch said. He disappeared through the door. Ava stood alone under fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency that vibrated in her teeth. The remaining men watched her the way they watched everything, with the patient, calculating stillness of people who'd learned that the world punished carelessness. 3 minutes later, the door opened. Stone Mercer filled the frame the way weather fills a valley, completely, without effort, without apology. 6'3", 240 pounds of scar tissue and silence. His face looked like a topographic map of damage, a burn scar running from his left temple down past his jawline, where a vehicle-borne IED had rewritten his features in Kandahar province 9 years ago. His left eye sat slightly lower than his right, giving his gaze an uneven intensity that made people look away. They always looked away. He wore a black thermal under his cut, Iron King's president patch on the chest, no rings, no watch. His hands were the hands of a man who'd built and broken things in equal measure for most of his life. He looked at Ava. Ava looked back. She didn't look away. Something shifted behind Stone's damaged face. Not softness. Stone hadn't been soft since before the war, but recognition. The recognition of someone who understood that the smallest people in the room often carried the heaviest intelligence. Dutch says you got something to show me. Ava pulled the photographs from inside her jacket. They were slightly warm from her body heat. She held them out the way a soldier presents evidence, without commentary, without apology, letting the material speak. Stone took the photos. His eyes moved across the images with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years reading terrain for threats. The van, the plates, the changing registrations, the passenger's profile, the timestamps Ava had written in pencil on the back of each print. The garage went absolutely silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim. You took these? Stone's voice was low, rough, like gravel being dragged across sheet metal. Yes, sir. From where? The curb outside Dell's. I sit there after school. Stone looked at the timestamps again. 3 different days, 3 different plates. Yes, sir. Same dent on the back door, same passenger. I checked. Colt pushed off the workbench and walked closer. He took one of the photos from Stone's hand and held it under the light with his remaining hand. His jaw tightened. That's a scouting pattern, Colt said quietly. Textbook. Stone didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the last photograph, the one where the passenger had raised the device toward the Iron King's gate. The angle was imperfect. The grain was heavy, but the intent was unmistakable. What's your name? Stone asked. Ava. Ava what? Hargrove. Nothing registered on Stone's face. The name didn't connect, not yet. That connection was buried under 9 years of bourbon and bad sleep, and the kind of forgetting that veterans practice like a survival skill. Ava Hargrove. You walk up to a motorcycle club alone in January at dark to show strangers surveillance photos. It wasn't a question. It was Stone trying to understand the math of a 12-year-old girl doing what adults wouldn't. They're watching your bikes, Ava said simply. I thought you should know. And you didn't go to the police? Ava's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes hardened. It was the expression of a child who'd called for help before and learned what happens when help doesn't come. The police don't come to this side of town for things like this, she said. You know that. Stone exhaled through his nose, a long, controlled breath, the kind of breath that replaces the words a man can't say in front of strangers. He handed the photos to Dutch. Get copies. Send them to every chapter and every allied club between here and Tennessee. Blackout protocol. No phones. Couriers only. Dutch nodded and moved. Stone looked down at Ava again. The fluorescent light carved shadows into the geography of his scars. Go home, he said. Lock your doors. Don't come back here. Why not? Because if these people figure out someone's been watching them, they'll want to know who. And you just showed your face to a clubhouse full of bikers who can't exactly deny you were here. Ava processed this with the calm of someone who'd already calculated the risk. I'm careful. Careful doesn't stop a bullet. Stone's voice dropped. Not angry. Tired. The exhaustion of a man who'd spent his life standing between violence and the people it wanted to consume. Ava put her hands in her jacket pockets. The camera hung around her neck like a talisman. My dad taught me to pay attention to things. He said that's how you keep people safe. By noticing. Stone's damaged eye twitched. A micro movement. Involuntary. Your dad military? Army, 2 tours. He's home now, but... She trailed off. The unfinished sentence carried more weight than any complete one could have. But what? He's home, Ava repeated, and the way she said it made the word home sound like a diagnosis. Stone watched her walk back through the gate and disappear into the dark street. The cold swallowed her like water swallowing a stone. He stood in the garage doorway for a long time after she left, exhaust smoke curling around his boots, the photographs already being copied on the old machine in the back room. Dutch and Colt worked in silence behind him. "Stone," Colt's voice. "Careful. You all right? Run the plates she gave us, all 3 sets." "Already on it." "And find out where that girl lives." Colt paused. "Why?" Stone didn't answer. He walked back inside the chapel and closed the door. In the dim light, he sat down at the scarred wooden table where the Iron Kings had made every important decision for the last 11 years and put his hands flat on the surface. He couldn't explain it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something about the girl, not just the intelligence, not just the courage, but the specific quality of her stillness, the way she'd stood in a room full of dangerous men and refused to shrink, had reached through 9 years of scar tissue and grabbed something he thought the war had killed. Ava Hargrove reminded him of someone, and the memory was a wound he hadn't looked at in a very long time. 2 days later, the information started coming back. The plates Ava photographed were registered to 3 different shell companies across 3 states: Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, all linked through a single address, a commercial mailbox service outside Roanoke that had been flagged twice by ATF for suspicious activity and twice cleared on insufficient evidence. Colt laid the findings on the chapel table while Stone drank black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The overhead bulb swung slightly from a draft nobody could locate, making the shadows shift across the walls like something breathing. "It's organized," Colt said, "not some local crew boosting bikes for parts. This is a network. They hit clubs in Georgia last spring, Tennessee in the fall. A chapter outside Asheville lost 8 bikes in one night, custom builds, 6-figure losses. And now they're scouting us. The pattern matches. They watch for 2 weeks, map the lot, figure out security rotations. Then they come in at 3, 4 in the morning with a flatbed and a stolen tow rig. 15 minutes. Clean." Stone stared at the photos pinned to the wall above the table. Ava's photos. Grainy. Imperfect. Devastating. A 12-year-old kid caught what 14 clubs missed. Colt didn't respond. He didn't need to. The fact sat in the room like a third person, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Stone reached for his phone, then stopped. Blackout protocol meant no digital communication. He'd sent physical couriers to 11 clubs across the eastern seaboard with copies of Ava's photographs and the plate information. Word was spreading through the network the old way, through trust, face-to-face contact, and the kind of loyalty that didn't leave digital fingerprints. Within 48 hours, 3 allied clubs reported that the same van, or vehicles matching its description, had been spotted near their territories in the weeks prior. One club in southwestern Virginia had already increased night patrols after losing 2 bikes to an unknown theft 3 months earlier. The net was closing, but it was closing in both directions. "Stone," Dutch appeared in the chapel doorway, his face carrying the expression of a man delivering bad news. The Roanoke chapter picked up chatter. The crew knows somebody tipped the clubs. Stone's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "They don't know who, not yet. But they're asking questions, and they know the tip originated from somewhere near Millbrook." The chapel went cold. Not the temperature. The air itself seemed to harden. "How close are they to figuring it out?" Dutch hesitated. "Close enough that we shouldn't wait to find out." Stone set the coffee down. The cup made no sound against the table. His hands were steady, the way a surgeon's hands are steady. Not from calm, but from years of performing under conditions where shaking meant dying. "Where's the girl right now?" "School, probably. It's Thursday." Stone stood. The chair scraped against the concrete floor with a sound like a short scream. "Find her address. Put eyes on her house. Nobody touches her. Nobody even looks at her wrong." His voice carried the flat terminal quality of an order that had already been decided before the words formed. "She walked into our house and gave us the one thing we needed. She's under our protection now. Full coverage. She just doesn't know it yet." "Stone, she's a civilian, a kid. If we put a visible presence," I said, "nobody touches her. I didn't say she needs to know we're there." Colt and Dutch exchanged a look. It was the look of men who recognized when their president had crossed from strategy into something older and more dangerous, something personal. That night, an Iron Kings prospect named Reno parked his bike 2 streets south of the Hargrove residence and walked to a spot beneath a dead oak tree where he could see the front door and the street in both directions. He wore dark clothes and carried nothing but a phone with a single number programmed. He didn't smoke. He didn't move. He watched. Inside the small house, Ava Hargrove sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, sorting through photographs she'd developed that afternoon. Street scenes, parking lots, a stray cat asleep on a dumpster lid. Normal things. Safe things. She had no idea that 3 blocks away, men in a rented sedan were running her school's public directory, cross-referencing students who lived in the East Side neighborhood near the Iron Kings. She had no idea that the photograph she'd handed to Stone Mercer had set off a chain reaction spreading across 5 states, and she had no idea that by tomorrow evening, the white van would appear on her street. At the same moment, Ava turned off her bedroom light and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Stone Mercer sat alone in the Iron King's chapel, staring at a name he'd written on a piece of scrap paper. Hargrove. The name vibrated in his chest like a frequency he couldn't tune out. He knew it from somewhere. Not from Millbrook, not from Virginia, from further away, from somewhere hot and dusty where the air smelled like diesel and copper and fear. He pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw white. The memory was there, trapped under scar tissue and a decade of practiced forgetting. A face, a voice, hands dragging him through rubble while the world burned. Someone screaming his name, not Stone, his real name, the one the army knew, while blood ran down both their faces and the sky split apart above them. Hargrove. Stone opened his eyes. His hands were shaking. He picked up the scrap of paper and stared at the name until the letters lost their meaning and became just shapes. Then he folded it once, placed it in his chest pocket, and walked out of the chapel into the frozen parking lot where the bikes sat in rows like sleeping animals. The wind hit his scars, and he didn't flinch. He hadn't flinched at anything in 9 years. But that name made him feel something he hadn't felt since Kandahar. And 3 miles east, in a dark sedan parked at the far end of Ava's street, a man opened a laptop, pulled up a school directory photo of a 12-year-old girl holding a camera, and sent it to a number with a Roanoke area code. The message read, "Found her." The message sat on the laptop screen for 11 seconds before the man in the sedan closed it. 11 seconds. Long enough for the image of a 12-year-old girl holding a broken camera to travel across encrypted servers through a rerouted signal tower outside Roanoke and into the phone of a man named Garrett Price who hadn't slept in 31 hours and hadn't felt remorse in considerably longer. Price read the message in a rented garage bay where 3 stolen motorcycles sat under tarps like bodies waiting for burial. He looked at the photo, studied it. A kid. Skinny. Dark hair. Holding the camera like it was the only thing keeping her upright. He typed back 2 words. Watch her. Then he set the phone down on a workbench covered in registration forgery blanks and VIN grinding tools, and lit a cigarette with hands that didn't shake because men like Garrett Price had stopped shaking a long time ago. Around the same time, they stopped caring about the distance between a problem and a solution. 3 miles west, Reno stood beneath the dead oak tree outside the Hargrove house and felt the cold crawl through his jacket like something alive. He'd been there 4 hours. His legs were numb. His phone hadn't buzzed. The house was dark. The street was empty. Then headlights appeared at the far end of the block. Slow, low beams, the kind of slow that doesn't belong in a residential neighborhood at 2 a.m. Reno pressed his back against the tree trunk and watched. The car, dark sedan, no visible plates from this angle, rolled past the Hargrove house at walking speed. Brake lights flared for half a second at the edge of the driveway, then released. The car continued to the end of the street, turned right, and disappeared. Reno's thumb was already on the phone. 1 number, 1 ring. Stone answered like he'd been awake, because he had. Dark sedan just rolled the house, slowed at the driveway. Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone thinking, the silence of someone who already knew what this meant and was deciding how much violence the answer required. Stay on her. I'm sending Dutch. The line went dead. Stone sat on the edge of his bed in the apartment above the Iron King's clubhouse, a space that could barely be called a room. Mattress on the floor, a chair, a window that looked out onto the parking lot. No pictures on the walls, no personal items except a folded American flag on the windowsill that he never looked at and never moved. He pulled on his boots in the dark, laced them tight. The mechanical repetition of the act steadied something inside him that had started vibrating the moment Reno's voice came through the phone. They were already watching her. Less than 48 hours after she'd walked into the clubhouse, and they were already on her street. He'd done this before. In Kandahar. In Helmand. In places where the people who helped you were the first ones the enemy came for, because killing the source was cheaper than fighting the information. He'd watched translators disappear, watched village elders who'd shared intelligence get found in ditches with their hands removed. He'd learned the lesson the hard way. The people who give you the truth are the people you owe the most, and the debt never gets smaller. Stone walked downstairs into the clubhouse common room where the smell of stale beer and cold cigarette ash hung in the air like a permanent season. Dutch was already there, pulling on his cut, his face carrying the tight-jawed expression of a man preparing for something he wished he didn't have to prepare for. Reno says they rolled her street. Dutch nodded. I heard. I want 2 men on her at all times, rotating shifts, 8 hours each, different positions every night. Nobody parks in the same spot twice. That's a lot of bodies for one kid, Stone. Stone turned and looked at Dutch with an expression that made the older man take half a step back without meaning to. It was the look Stone had carried out of the war. Not anger, not exactly, but something colder. The look of a man who had already decided what he was willing to do and was simply waiting for the world to give him the reason. She's not one kid. She's the reason we still have our bikes. She's the reason 11 clubs up and down the coast know what's coming. She walked in here alone, in the cold, when she could have walked away. Stone's voice dropped. I've seen grown men who wouldn't do what she did. Dutch said nothing. He zipped his jacket and walked toward the door. Dutch. The older man stopped. Her last name is Hargrove. I know. Does that name mean anything to you? Dutch frowned, thought about it, shook his head. Should it? Stone didn't answer. He walked back upstairs and sat in the dark with the folded flag and the name that wouldn't stop burning a hole through his chest. Morning came gray and hostile, the kind of January morning where the sky looks like concrete and the air tastes like metal. Ava walked to school at 7:15, backpack over one shoulder, camera around her neck, breath forming small clouds that disappeared before they reached her chin. She passed a man sitting in a parked truck 2 blocks from her house, reading a newspaper. She didn't notice him. She didn't notice the second man on a motorcycle idling near the school entrance, wearing a plain jacket with no patches visible. She didn't notice the third, Colt, sitting in a coffee shop across from the school's front door with a cup he never drank from and a clear line of sight to every exit. She noticed other things. She noticed that Mrs. Brennan, her homeroom teacher, had a bruise on her wrist she kept covering with her sleeve. She noticed that the kid who sat behind her in math, Tyler something, had stopped eating lunch 3 days ago and now sat in the library pretending to read. She noticed the crack in the gymnasium window had grown 2 inches since Monday. Ava noticed everything except the things designed to stay invisible. At 3:30, she walked to Dell's. Same curb. Same routine. She bought a coffee with too much sugar and sat down with her camera and started shooting. Colt watched her from the coffee shop window. His prosthetic hand rested on the table like a sculpture. Something tightened in his throat as he watched the girl compose her shots. The deliberate way she framed each image, the patience, the stillness. She reminded him of the spotters he'd worked with in Iraq, the ones who could sit for hours without moving, watching a single doorway, waiting for the moment that would change everything. His phone buzzed. Stone. She at Dell's? Same spot. Every day like clockwork. The sedan from last night. Reno got a partial plate. We ran it. Rental company out of Roanoke. Paid cash. Fake ID. So they're spending money to find her. They're spending money to find who tipped us. She's the shortest line between the question and the answer. Colt watched Ava lift her camera toward the street. Click. Wind click. The mechanical sound barely audible through the window glass. She's a kid, Stone. She doesn't even know. I know what she doesn't know. That's why we're here. The line went dead. Colt set the phone down and wrapped his remaining hand around the coffee cup, feeling the warmth bleed into his palm. He flexed the prosthetic. Phantom pain shot through the wrist that wasn't there anymore, the way it always did when his body remembered something his mind was trying to forget. That evening, the first fracture appeared inside the club. It started at the regular Thursday meeting in the chapel. 12 members seated around the scarred table, Stone at the head, the overhead bulb casting its usual sickly light. Cigarette smoke rising toward a ceiling stained the color of old teeth. A member named Briggs, 42, former Navy, ran a welding shop on the south side and had been with the Iron Kings for 6 years. Leaned forward with his elbows on the table and said what 3 other men were thinking but hadn't said. "We're burning resources on a surveillance op for a little girl we don't know. Meanwhile, we got a confirmed theft crew targeting our property, and we're sitting here playing babysitter." The room temperature dropped. Not literally, but every man at the table felt it. Stone didn't look at Briggs. He looked at the photographs pinned to the wall. Ava's photographs. She's not a job. She's not a resource drain. She gave us actionable intelligence that's protecting clubs across 5 states. Right now, because of those photos, the broken chains in Tennessee aren't losing their bikes tonight. The road saints outside Asheville still have their custom builds. We owe her. We owe her a thank you card. Maybe $100 for film. We don't owe her 24/7 protection detail that's pulling our guys off their regular what? Stone's voice didn't rise. It hardened, like liquid cooling into iron. Their regular sitting around this garage drinking and pretending the world outside doesn't exist? She did more for this brotherhood in one afternoon than most of us have done in a year. Briggs's face reddened. His jaw worked. The other men watched the exchange the way men watch a fuse burn, knowing the explosion is coming, not knowing the size. "I'm not questioning the girl, Stone. I'm questioning the scale. 2 men, 24 hours, indefinite. For a civilian. We've never done that, not even for members' families. We've never had a 12-year-old walk through that door and hand us a gift like this either. And if they come for her, what then? We start a war with a theft ring over a kid who isn't ours?" Stone stood up. The chair didn't scrape this time. It went over backward and hit the floor with a sound that made every man in the room flinch. "She is ours." Each word landed like a boot on pavement. She walked through that gate. She showed her face. She trusted us with what she found. That makes her ours. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked. You protect the people who trust you, or you take off that cut and walk out the door. Those are your 2 options, Briggs. Pick one. The chapel went silent. The kind of silence that has mass and pressure. The kind that fills your lungs and makes breathing harder. Briggs looked around the table. No one met his eyes. Not because they disagreed with him entirely. Some of them shared his concerns. But because challenging Stone Mercer in this room on this subject, with that expression on his scarred face, was the tactical equivalent of standing in front of a freight train and asking it to reconsider. "I'm not taking off my cut," Briggs said quietly. "Then we're done talking about this." Stone picked up his chair, sat back down. The meeting continued, but something had shifted in the room. A hairline crack that everyone could feel but no one would name. The club was unified. Until it wasn't. And the distance between those 2 states was shorter than any of them wanted to believe. After the meeting, Colt found Stone in the garage, alone, standing over the Heritage Softail that still hadn't been fixed. The engine was cold. The parts were spread across the floor in the same positions they'd been in when Ava first walked in. Nobody had touched them. As if the bike had become a monument to the moment everything changed. "Briggs isn't wrong about the resources," Colt said carefully. "I know. He's wrong about everything else. I know that too." Colt leaned against the workbench. The prosthetic clicked against the metal surface. "You want to tell me what's really going on?" Stone picked up a wrench, turned it in his hands, set it down. "I looked up her father." Colt waited. "Sergeant First Class David Hargrove, 2 tours, Afghanistan, Purple Heart, traumatic brain injury, medical discharge, 2017. Stone's voice was flat, reciting facts the way you recite things you don't want to feel. "He's alive. He's in that house. But from what the school records indicate, She listed her mother as sole emergency contact, sole guardian, sole everything. He's not functioning. TBI? Bad one. The kind where you come home but you don't come all the way home. Colt was quiet for a long time. He looked at his prosthetic hand, the one the army gave him after Fallujah, the one that worked mechanically but would never feel warmth or cold or the grain of a wooden table or the weight of another person's hand. So she's got a father who's there but not there, and a mother working doubles who's running on fumes, and a neighborhood where the cops don't come. And now she's got men in sedans driving past her house at 2 a.m. because she had the guts to do the right thing. Stone's hands pressed flat against the workbench. The tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. She's 12, and she's already more alone than most people get in a lifetime. Is that why you're doing this? Because of what happened to her dad? Stone looked at Colt with an expression that answered the question and closed it simultaneously. I'm doing this because it's the right thing. And if I have to burn every resource this club has to keep one kid safe, I will. And anyone who has a problem with that can have it somewhere else. Colt nodded slowly. He didn't push further. He'd served with Stone long enough to know when the man was operating from strategy and when he was operating from something deeper. Something that lived in the part of his brain the IED hadn't been able to destroy because it was too far down, buried under trauma and scar tissue and years of silence. The thing about Stone Mercer that most people didn't understand was that his hardness wasn't armor. It was architecture. It was load-bearing. Remove it, and everything behind it collapsed. Friday came cold and quiet. Ava went to school, came home, did homework at the kitchen table while her mother slept in the bedroom with the door closed and the sound of labored breathing leaking through the thin walls. At 9:15, Ava heated the dinner from the microwave, leftover pasta that tasted like nothing, and ate standing at the counter because sitting down felt too permanent. She looked out the kitchen window at the dark street. A truck she didn't recognize was parked 4 houses down. She noticed it, cataloged it, filed it alongside every other anomaly her brain collected and sorted automatically, the way a machine processes data without understanding what it means. She picked up her camera and aimed it through the window. Click. If she'd known that the truck belonged to an Iron King's prospect named Wheel, who was sitting in the cab with a thermos of cold coffee and a loaded .45 under the seat, she might have felt safer. If she'd known that the sedan from 2 nights ago had returned that afternoon and parked at the opposite end of her street for 45 minutes before leaving, she might have felt terrified. Instead, she felt what she always felt. The low hum of awareness. The sense that the world was full of patterns that most people couldn't read, and she couldn't stop reading. She went to bed at 10. The house settled around her with the sound of old wood contracting in the cold. Down the hall, her father sat in his room in the dark. She could hear the chair creak when he shifted. He'd been sitting in that chair for 11 months. Same chair, same window. Same view of a backyard that needed mowing and a fence that needed fixing and a life that needed something neither he nor anyone else knew how to provide. David Hargrove had been a different man before Kandahar. Ava had photographs to prove it. A man who smiled, a man who carried her on his shoulders, a man whose hands built things instead of trembling against his thighs while his eyes stared at something that wasn't in the room. The TBI had taken pieces of him the way a river takes pieces of a bank. Slowly, invisibly, until one day you look and the shape of everything has changed. He remembered her name. He remembered her face. But the connection between recognition and response had been severed somewhere in the blast that rearranged his brain, and no amount of therapy or medication or love had been able to rewire it. Ava stopped trying to reach him 8 months ago. Not because she'd given up, because trying hurt more than accepting. She pulled the blanket up and listened to the chair creak down the hall and the wind push against the windows and the distant, faint rumble of a motorcycle engine somewhere in the dark that she couldn't quite place. Saturday morning, Stone made a decision that would cross a line he couldn't uncross. He rode to the Hargrove house alone. No cut. Plain jacket. He parked the Harley 2 blocks away and walked. The neighborhood was working-class suburban. Small houses with small yards and the kind of quiet that comes from exhaustion rather than peace. Peeling paint, sagging gutters, cars that ran but didn't run well. He stood on the sidewalk across from the house for 3 minutes, watching. The front porch had a light that was burned out. The mailbox was full. A child's bicycle, too small for a 12-year-old, leaned against the garage, a relic from years ago that nobody had moved. He crossed the street and knocked on the door. Sarah Hargrove answered in scrubs and bare feet. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something. Sleep, probably, or the pale imitation of it that people in her situation called rest. She looked at Stone and her body went rigid. Not because she recognized him, because she recognized the type, the size, the scars, the bearing of a man who had spent time in places where doors got knocked on for reasons nobody wanted to hear. Mrs. Hargrove. Whatever you're selling, I'm not selling anything. My name is Stone Mercer. I'm with the Iron Kings Motorcycle Club. He watched her face carefully. Your daughter came to see us 4 days ago. Sarah's expression cycled through 3 emotions in 2 seconds. Confusion, fear, and something sharper than both. She stepped onto the porch and pulled the door half closed behind her, blocking the interior from view. My daughter went where? She walked into our clubhouse with photographs she'd taken of men who've been surveilling our property. She showed them to me personally. Sarah's hand tightened on the doorframe. Her knuckles went white. She's 12. I know. She walked into a biker clubhouse, alone. Yes, ma'am. And you let her? She was already inside before anyone could stop her. Your daughter is determined. Sarah's mouth opened, closed. Her eyes glistened, but nothing fell. She had the discipline of someone who had stopped allowing herself to break in front of strangers a long time ago. What men? What photographs? What are you talking about? Stone told her. Carefully. Methodically. The van. The changing plates. The theft ring spanning 5 states. The photos Ava had taken, the intelligence she'd provided. He left out the sedan on her street. He left out the message. He left out the scope of the danger because telling a mother the full truth would either destroy her or make her do something reckless, and neither outcome kept Ava safe. Sarah listened. The cold wind moved her hair, and she didn't fix it. Her bare feet on the frozen porch concrete didn't shift. When Stone finished, she was quiet for 15 seconds. Is she in danger? Stone could have lied. He'd been trained to lie. He'd lied to superior officers, to intelligence assets, to dying men who asked if they were going to make it. Lying was a tool. Sometimes a necessary one. He looked at Sarah Hargrove's face, the exhaustion, the fear, the fierce maternal architecture that held her together despite everything working to pull her apart, and told the truth. There's a possibility. That's why I'm here. Sarah's hand moved from the door frame to her mouth. She pressed her fingers against her lips. The gesture was involuntary, the body trying to hold in the sound the mind wouldn't allow. I'm going to protect her, Stone said. That's not a request. That's not a negotiation. Your daughter helped my club when she didn't have to, and I'm going to make sure that decision doesn't cost her anything. I have men watching this house right now. They've been here since Tuesday night. Sarah's eyes moved to the street. She saw the truck 4 houses down, the man inside who she'd thought was a neighbor's visitor. Her face changed. You've been watching my house? Watching over it, without telling me. I'm telling you now. The air between them vibrated with the tension of 2 people standing on opposite sides of a line that was simultaneously boundary and bridge. Sarah's jaw tightened. Her eyes, tired, sharp, furious, searched Stone's scarred face for something. Deception, manipulation, danger. What she found was something she hadn't expected, something she hadn't seen in a man's face in a very long time. Sincerity, the kind that cost something. My husband is inside, Sarah said slowly. He served 2 tours. I know. He's not well. I know that too. Sarah's eyes narrowed. How much do you know about my family? Enough to know your daughter didn't learn to pay attention from nowhere. Enough to know she carries herself like someone who was taught by a soldier. Enough to know that what happened to your husband is the kind of thing that doesn't just happen to one person. It happens to the whole house. Something broke behind Sarah's eyes. Not visibly, not with tears or sound, but something structural, something load-bearing. She's all I have, Sarah whispered. She's the only thing in this house that still works. Stone said nothing. Some truths don't need a response. They need a witness. How long? Sarah asked. How long what? How long will you watch her? Until the threat is eliminated. And if it isn't? Stone looked at her the way he'd looked at the men in his unit before every mission. The look that meant, I will carry you if I have to. I will bleed for you if it comes to that. And I will not explain why, because the explanation doesn't matter. Only the act. Then we'll still be here. Sarah pulled her arms across her chest. The wind cut across the porch, and she shivered but didn't go inside. I don't trust men with motorcycles and scars who show up on my porch making promises about my daughter. You shouldn't. Trust is earned. I'm not asking for it. I'm telling you what I'm going to do regardless. Sarah studied him one more time. Then she nodded. Once. Tight. The nod of a woman who didn't have the luxury of better options. Stone turned and walked down the porch steps. He was 6 feet from the sidewalk when Sarah's voice reached him. Mercer. He stopped. If anything happens to her, anything, I will find you. And whatever you survived in the war won't compare. Stone almost smiled. Not quite. The scar tissue made it impossible to tell. Yes, ma'am. He walked back to his bike in the gray morning light, boots on cold pavement, exhaust from distant traffic drifting through the neighborhood like fog. His phone buzzed as he reached the Harley. Colt. He answered. Stone, we've got a problem. Go. The Roanoke chapter just intercepted a communication from the theft crew. They're not pulling back. They're accelerating. 3 clubs hit last night. North Carolina, West Virginia, and Southern Virginia. They're moving fast and they're moving angry. Stone straddled the bike. The cold leather seat pressed through his jeans. They're trying to finish before the network shuts them down. That's what it looks like, but there's something else. What? Colt paused. In the background, Stone could hear the clubhouse, muffled voices, the clink of tools, an engine being tested. The communication mentioned Millbrook specifically. They called it the source, and they said they're sending someone to deal with it. Stone's hand tightened on the handlebar grip. The leather creaked. Send someone to deal with what? The communication didn't specify, but Stone, there was a name attached to whoever they're sending. Garrett Price. I ran it. Former military. Dishonorable discharge. 2 assault convictions. 1 attempted murder charge that got plea bargain down. He's not a bike thief. He's a fixer. The engine didn't start. Stone sat on the bike in the cold silence of the street, with the phone pressed against his scarred face, and the wind pulling at his jacket, and the weight of the last 4 days pressing down on his shoulders like something physical. A fixer. They were sending a fixer. Not someone to steal motorcycles, someone to remove problems. And the only problem in Millbrook connected to the operation was a 12-year-old girl with a broken camera and a father who couldn't protect her, and a mother who was already breaking under the weight of everything. Stone started the engine. The Harley roared to life beneath him, the sound splitting the quiet neighborhood open like a wound. Call church. Full table. 1 hour. Stone, 1 hour, Colt, and tell every man at that table that what we voted to do for the Hargrove girl just stopped being a protection detail. He pulled onto the street and the cold air hit his scars, and this time, for the first time in 9 years, he felt it. It's a war. Church lasted 47 minutes. It should have lasted 10. Stone stood at the head of the table with Ava's photographs pinned to the wall behind him and a single sheet of paper in his hand. Colt's intelligence brief on Garrett Price. He read it once to the room, no embellishment, no commentary, just facts laid out like rounds on a table. Garrett Price. Age 41. Former Army. Dishonorable discharge following a court-martial for aggravated assault on a superior officer. 2 civilian assault convictions. 1 attempted murder charge reduced to aggravated battery through a plea deal that involved testimony against a former associate. Last known employment. Private security contractor for a firm that had lost its federal license 18 months ago. Current status? Freelance. The kind of freelance that didn't involve a resume. Stone set the paper down. They're not sending a thief. They're sending someone whose job is to make problems disappear. And the only problem in Millbrook is the girl. 12 men sat around the table, 12 faces in the sickly light, 12 sets of hands, Scarred, calloused, tattooed, one prosthetic, resting on wood that had absorbed a decade of spilled bourbon and cigarette burns and decisions that couldn't be taken back. Briggs spoke first. Of course Briggs spoke first. "We need to go to the cops." "With what?" Colt's voice was cold, clinical. The voice of a man who'd spent years working with military intelligence and understood exactly how little civilian law enforcement could do with what they had. Photographs of a van, plate numbers linked to shell companies, an intercepted communication we obtained through channels that would get every man at this table arrested. The cops can't move on this, not fast enough. Then what are we supposed to do? Go to war with a professional? We protect the girl. Stone's voice cut through the room like a blade through drywall. That's what we do. That's the only thing we do. Everything else is secondary. For how long? Briggs leaned forward, his knuckles pressed white against the table. A week? A month? A year? We're a motorcycle club, Stone. We're not the Secret Service. We don't have the manpower for indefinite... Then we make the manpower. How? Stone looked at Colt. Something passed between them. The wordless shorthand of men who'd served together, fought together, bled in the same dirt. Colt nodded once and pulled a folded map from inside his cut. He spread it across the table, pressing the corners flat with his palm and his prosthetic. The map showed Millbrook and the surrounding 50-mile radius. Red circles marked the locations of allied clubs. Blue circles marked known or suspected locations connected to the theft operation. Green lines traced the routes between them. "We call in favors," Colt said. "Every club that received Ava's intel. Every chapter that avoided a hit because of what she documented. They owe us. More importantly, they owe her. We ask for riders. 2 from each club. Rotating. That gives us enough coverage to maintain a protection perimeter around the Hargrove house, her school, and her daily routes for as long as we need. You want to bring outside riders into our territory?" A member named Knox, quiet, mid-50s, ran a body shop and rarely spoke at meetings, looked up from the map. "That's never been done. A 12-year-old walking into a clubhouse with surveillance photos has never been done either," Stone said. "We're past precedent." The vote was called. 11-1. Briggs dissented. Nobody was surprised. Nobody held it against him either, not yet, because dissent in the Iron Kings wasn't betrayal. It was a man exercising the right the club gave every patched member. The difference between dissent and betrayal was what happened after the vote. Briggs voted no. Then he put on his jacket and took a shift watching the Hargrove house without being asked. That was Saturday night. By Monday morning, riders from 4 allied clubs had arrived in Millbrook. They came in 1s and 2s without patches visible, on bikes that didn't attract attention. They parked in driveways of sympathetic residents. They sat in diners and gas stations. They walked dogs they'd borrowed from members' families. They became invisible the way only people trained in operational discipline can become invisible, by looking exactly like everyone else. Ava Hargrove walked to school Monday morning past 3 men who would have taken a bullet for her and didn't recognize a single one. But the net had a hole, and the hole had a name. Tuesday afternoon, Stone's phone rang. Not the club phone. His personal cell. A number he didn't recognize. He answered it in this chapel with the door closed and the overhead light casting his shadow against the wall like something trying to escape. Stone Mercer. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty. "My name is Garrett Price. I think we should talk." Stone's blood went cold. Not his face. His face didn't change. His hand didn't tighten on the phone. But somewhere deep inside the architecture that held him together, a structural beam cracked. "How'd you get this number?" "The same way I get everything. Patience and the right questions." "What do you want?" "I want to make this easy, for both of us." Price's voice carried the accent of Western Virginia, flattened vowels, dropped consonants, the sound of mountain hollows and abandoned coal towns. "You've got something I need, a camera, some photographs, and the person who took them. I want all 3. Stone said nothing. His jaw worked. His scar tissue pulled. "I know what you're thinking," Price continued. "You're thinking about how many men you've got outside that girl's house. You're thinking about the network you've built, the favors you've called in, The riders from allied clubs scattered around town pretending to be civilians. A pause. The kind of pause a man leaves when he wants the silence to deliver the message. I know about all of it, Mercer. Every position, every rotation, every shift change. The crack inside Stone widened. Not into panic. Stone didn't panic, hadn't panicked since Kandahar, but into the specific, ice-cold recognition that the enemy had better intelligence than he'd assumed. You're bluffing. Black pickup truck, 2 blocks south. Prospect named Reno. He switches with a man named Wheel at midnight. The guy with the prosthetic hand sits in the coffee shop across from the school. The older one, Dutch, runs the overnight from a parked sedan on Birch Street. Should I keep going? Stone pressed his palm flat against the table. The wood was cold. His hand left a print of sweat. How? Because one of your people told me. The sentence detonated in the room like a concussion grenade. No fire, no shrapnel, just a blast wave that rearranged everything. That's a lie. It's not. And you know it's not. Because you're already running the math in your head. 12 men at the table, 4 outside clubs sending riders, prospects, associates, sympathizers. That's a lot of mouths, Mercer, and I only needed 1. The line went dead. Stone sat motionless for 90 seconds. The phone screen dimmed, then went dark. His reflection stared back at him from the black glass. A scarred face with an expression that had passed through anger and arrived at something far more dangerous. Someone inside the club had talked. Not an allied rider, not a prospect. Someone who knew the rotation schedule, the shift changes, the names. Someone who sat at the table. Stone stood, walked to the door, opened it. The common room beyond was empty except for Dutch, who was cleaning a carburetor at the bar with the focused attention of a man who treated mechanical work the way monks treated meditation. Dutch, close the shop, lock the gate, nobody in or out until I say. Dutch looked up, read Stone's face, set down the carburetor without wiping his hands. What happened? Price called me. On my personal cell. Dutch's face changed. The wrinkles around his eyes deepened. His mouth tightened into a line that had no room for words. He knows everything. Positions, names, rotations, all of it. How? He says someone at the table told him. The words hit Dutch like a physical impact. The older man took half a step backward. His oil-stained hand gripped the edge of the bar. That's not possible. It's possible. It's happening. And right now, I don't know who I can trust in this room, which means I don't know who I can trust anywhere. Stone's voice had dropped to the register he used when things were worst. Quiet, controlled, each word selected with the precision of a man choosing which wire to cut on an explosive device. Pull Reno and Wheel off the Hargrove house. Replace them with allied riders. Nobody from our chapter goes near that girl until I know where the leak is. Stone, if you pull our own men off and use outside riders exclusively, the club's going to... I don't care what the club's going to do. The girl is the priority. The leak is the threat. Everything else is noise. Dutch nodded slowly. Not agreement, exactly. Obedience. The kind that comes from 20 years of following a man you trust, even when the trust is being tested by the worst possible circumstances. Stone went back to the chapel and closed the door and sat in the dark. 12 men at the table. One of them had given up the protection detail. One of them had sold out a 12-year-old girl for reasons Stone couldn't yet see. Money, fear, leverage, some pressure point that Price had found and pressed. Stone ran the list in his head, name by name, face by face. He weighed each man against everything he knew about them, their service records, their debts, their families, their weaknesses. He thought about Briggs and the dissenting vote and the grudge that might or might not be festering beneath the man's compliance. He thought about Knox, who was quiet and careful and had connections in Roanoke nobody talked about. He thought about a prospect named Davis who'd patched in 8 months ago and whose background check had come back clean, but whose eyes sometimes move the way the eyes of people who are listening for someone else move. He couldn't know. Not yet. And not knowing was the most dangerous state a man could occupy, because it meant every decision from this point forward was built on ground that might not hold. The rain started at 4 o'clock. Not the dramatic cinematic rain of movie storms. The gray, persistent, exhausting rain of a Virginia January. Cold, fine, endless. The kind that doesn't soak you all at once, but saturates you slowly until you realize you've been wet for an hour. It ran down the clubhouse windows in crooked lines. It pooled in the parking lot where the bikes sat under tarps like sleeping animals. It turned the street outside into a mirror that reflected the neon of Dell's sign in distorted, bleeding colors. Ava sat on the curb outside Dell's in the rain, shooting photographs. She'd stopped caring about getting wet a long time ago. Wet was a condition, not an emergency. She had 3 rolls of film left and she intended to use them before the light died. She photographed the rain hitting chrome, the reflection of taillights in a puddle, an old man crossing the street with a newspaper over his head, moving with the resigned slowness of someone who had stopped trying to outrun weather a lifetime ago. She didn't photograph the man sitting in a truck across the street who wasn't from around here. She didn't notice him because he was good at not being noticed. Better than Reno, better than Wheel, better than any of the Iron King's prospects. He was an allied rider from the Broken Chains, a Tennessee chapter that had sent 2 men north after Stone's call. His name was Mac, and he'd ridden 11 hours through the night to sit in a truck in the rain and watch a girl he'd never met because a motorcycle club he'd never visited had called in a debt his chapter owed. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Not blood, not contracts, just the understanding that when someone protected your people, you protected theirs. But Mac didn't know about the leak. Nobody outside Stone, Dutch, and Colt knew about the leak, and that meant Mac was sitting in a position that had already been compromised, watching a girl whose location was already known, providing protection that had already been mapped by the enemy. At 5:15, Stone made 2 phone calls. The first was to Sarah Hargrove. He stood in the garage with rain dripping from the roll-up door and his boots in a puddle of water and motor oil that reflected the ceiling light like a dirty mirror. "Mrs. Hargrove, it's Stone." "I know who it is." Her voice was tight, controlled. The voice of a woman managing fear with the same discipline she used to manage double shifts and a broken husband and a daughter who kept walking into danger. "What's wrong?" "I need you to keep Ava inside for the next few days. No walking to Dell's. No walking to school. Keep the doors locked and the curtains drawn." Silence. The rain hitting the roof of the garage was the only sound. "Tell me why." "Because the situation has escalated and I can't guarantee her safety in open spaces right now." "You told me you had men watching." "I do. But there's a complication I can't explain on the phone. Just keep her inside. I'll come by tomorrow and explain in person." "Mercer." Sarah's voice dropped. He could hear her breathing change, shorter, shallower, the respiration pattern of someone whose fight or flight response had just engaged. "If you're telling me my daughter is in more danger than you originally said, I need to know right now, not tomorrow, now." Stone closed his eyes. The rain was louder now, hammering the metal roof. Water ran down the walls of the garage in streams that looked like veins. "Someone inside my organization leaked information about the protection detail. The people we're protecting Ava from now know the positions, the names, the schedule. I'm reconfiguring everything. Outside riders only. New positions. New rotations. But until that's in place, there's a window, and I need Ava off the street during that window." The silence on the line was the silence of a mother processing the worst possible information with the discipline of a woman who'd already survived worse. "How long is the window?" 24 hours, maybe less. "And after that?" "After that, I will personally guarantee that no one gets within 100 yards of your daughter." Sarah exhaled. It was the sound of someone letting go of the last illusion that the world was manageable. "I'll keep her home." The second call was to Colt. "I need you to run a financial check on every member at the table. Bank deposits, cash flows, anything unusual in the last 60 days. And I need it quiet." Colt was silent for 3 seconds. "You want me to investigate our own brothers. I want you to find the one who sold us out." "Stone, if the club finds out we're running internal, the club can find out after the girl is safe. Until then, you answer to me. Not the table, not the bylaws. Me." Another silence. Longer this time. Stone could hear Colt's prosthetic clicking against a hard surface. The nervous tic the man had developed in place of the finger tapping his left hand could no longer perform. "I'll have something by morning." The rain continued through the night. Stone didn't sleep. He sat in the chapel with the overhead light off, and the only illumination coming from the orange glow of a cigarette he'd bummed from Dutch. He'd quit smoking 3 years ago, but some nights demanded the ritual of burning something. He thought about Ava, the way she'd stood in this room 4 days ago, the broken camera, the photographs, the absolute stillness of a child who'd learned to survive by becoming invisible. He thought about David Hargrove, the name that lived in his chest like a splinter working its way toward his heart. And then, at 2:17 in the morning, alone in the dark chapel with rain hammering the roof and cigarette ash falling silently onto the table, the memory finally broke through. It came in fragments, the way all war memories come, not as a narrative, but as sensory data. Heat, dust, the taste of blood and copper, the concussive pressure of an explosion that compressed the air into something solid. Then the images. A street in Kandahar, a convoy, the lead vehicle lifting off the ground as the IED detonated beneath it. Stone, not Stone yet, still Sergeant First Class Marcus Mercer, thrown sideways against the interior of the second vehicle, his helmet cracking against the doorframe, the left side of his face catching fire. And then the hands grabbing his body armor, hands dragging him through the shattered door. Hands that belonged to a man who was bleeding from his own shrapnel wounds but kept pulling, kept moving, kept carrying Stone through smoke and debris toward the casualty collection point while rounds cracked overhead and the world ended in every direction. A voice. Hoarse. Desperate. "Stay with me, Mercer. Stay with me. Don't you close your eyes." The face attached to the voice was young, mid-20s, dirty, streaked with blood and dust. Eyes wide with fear, but hands steady. A soldier operating on training and adrenaline and the stubborn refusal to let another man die on his watch. Specialist David Hargrove. Stone opened his eyes. The chapel was dark. The cigarette had burned to the filter. The rain had stopped. And the memory was complete. David Hargrove had saved his life. Dragged him 40 meters under fire. Applied a tourniquet to Stone's leg with hands that were shaking from his own injuries. Stayed with him until the medevac arrived, talking the entire time. About his wife, about a baby they were expecting, about a camera he was going to buy when he got home because he wanted to photograph everything he'd missed. A camera. Stone pressed his hands against his eyes. His shoulders shook. Not crying. Stone didn't cry. Hadn't cried since before the war. But something seismic. Something tectonic. A plate shift deep inside the geology of his trauma that rearranged the landscape of everything he thought he understood. David Hargrove saved his life. And now David Hargrove's daughter was in danger because she'd walked into Stone's clubhouse and done the same thing her father would have done. Helped someone, without being asked, without expecting anything in return. The debt wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't a vague feeling of recognition or an unexplained connection to a girl with a broken camera. It was specific. It was concrete. It was a 40-meter drag through fire and blood, and the voice of a man saying, "Stay with me while the world burned." Stone owed David Hargrove his life, and the only payment that mattered now was keeping Hargrove's daughter alive. At 6 in the morning, Colt walked into the chapel with a laptop and the expression of a man carrying a weight he wished he could set down. "I found it." Stone looked up. His eyes were red, not from crying, from hours of not blinking. "Show me." Colt opened the laptop. The screen illuminated his face in pale blue light. Davis, the prospect who patched in 8 months ago. Clean background check, clean record. But his bank account received a cash deposit of $9,000 6 days ago, just under the reporting threshold. The deposit came from a check cashing service in Roanoke. Stone stared at the screen, the numbers, the dates, the damning, undeniable arithmetic of betrayal. Where is he now? He was on rotation last night, overnight at the East Perimeter. Colt paused. He didn't show. Wheel covered for him, said Davis called in sick. Sick. That's what he said. Stone closed the laptop, slowly, deliberately. The way a man closes a book he's finished reading and doesn't intend to read again. Find him. And when we do? Stone stood. He pulled on his cut, adjusted the president patch on his chest, walked toward the door, stopped. When we do, he's going to tell me everything, every piece of information he gave Price, every position, every name, every word. And then he's going to tell me what Price is planning and when. And if he won't talk? Stone looked back over his shoulder. The morning light coming through the garage door caught the burn scar on his face and turned it silver. Everyone talks, Colt. It's just a matter of what they're more afraid of. They found Davis at 11 o'clock that morning in a motel room 14 miles outside Millbrook. He was packing a bag. 2 prepaid phones sat on the nightstand next to a Glock he'd bought the week before without telling anyone at the club. His Iron King's cut was draped over the back of a chair, the patches still attached, as if he'd planned to leave them behind as a final message. Colt and Dutch entered through the door. Stone came through the bathroom window. Davis didn't run. He didn't reach for the weapon. He stood in the middle of the motel room with a half-packed bag in his hands and the expression of a man who'd known this moment was coming and had been waiting for it the way a condemned man waits for the sound of the bolt. "Sit down," Stone said. Davis sat on the edge of the bed. His hands trembled. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The hands of a man whose body was already processing what his mind hadn't admitted. "How much did he pay you?" Stone's voice was quiet, conversational, more terrifying than shouting because it carried the restraint of a man choosing not to do what every nerve in his body was demanding. 9,000. Davis's voice was thin, reedy. The voice of a man who'd rehearsed this confession and now couldn't remember the words. For what? The protection schedule. Names, positions, shift rotations. What else? Davis's eyes dropped to the floor. The carpet was brown with cigarette burns and stains that nobody wanted to identify. The girl's address, her school, her daily routine. The room went vacuum silent, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. Dutch's hand moved involuntarily toward his belt. Colt's prosthetic clenched into a fist with a mechanical sound that cut through the quiet like a bone breaking. Stone didn't move. He stood 3 feet from Davis and looked down at the man with an expression that was beyond anger, beyond disgust. It was the expression of someone staring at a wound that had been inflicted from the inside, the specific, unforgivable treachery of a man who wore the patch and sold the people the patch was supposed to protect. You gave a 12-year-old girl's home address to a man whose job is making people disappear. Davis's chin dropped to his chest. His shoulders curved inward. The posture of collapse, of gravity, winning. He said they just wanted the photos. He said nobody would get hurt. He said, "You believe that?" The question hung in the air. Davis didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was worse than any lie he could construct. He hadn't believed it. He'd known exactly what Price was. He'd known what the information would be used for. And he'd sold it anyway because $9,000 was enough to cover 3 months of back rent and a gambling debt he'd been hiding since before he'd ever put on the cut. "When is Price coming?" Stone's voice didn't change register. The calm was absolute, surgical. "I don't know exactly. He said within the week." "To do what?" Davis looked up. His eyes were wet. His face was gray. "He said he'd take care of the source. That's what he called her. The source." Stone turned away. He walked to the motel window and looked out at the parking lot where the rain had started again, falling in sheets across cracked asphalt and rusted car hoods, and a dumpster with a broken lid that banged in the wind like a slow, arrhythmic heartbeat. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. The scar. The uneven eyes. The face of a man who'd survived a war and built a brotherhood and protected strangers and failed to protect his own house from a traitor who'd been sitting at his table for 8 months. "Take his cut," Stone said without turning around. "Take his phone. Take the weapon. Drive him to the state line and leave him there. If he comes back to Millbrook, if he contacts any member of this club or any allied chapter, if he goes anywhere near that girl or her family..." Stone stopped. His hand pressed against the window glass. The cold seeped through his palm. "Then I'll finish what Kandahar started." Dutch took the cut. The sound of the patches tearing free was the sound of something that couldn't be repaired. They drove Davis to the state line in silence. No one spoke. No one needed to. By the time Stone returned to the clubhouse, the rain had turned to sleet, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the world outside the garage looked like something designed to test the limits of what a man could endure. He walked into the chapel, sat at the table, spread Colt's map in front of him, and stared at the positions, the routes, the green lines connecting places where allies waited, and the blue circles marking places where the enemy operated. Everything Davis had given Price was compromised. Every position, every rotation, every name, which meant everything had to change. New positions, new faces, new routes, new schedules built from scratch with information that Davis never had access to. Stone picked up his phone and dialed the first of 11 calls he would make in the next hour. One to each Allied club, one to Colt, one to Dutch, and one to a man in Richmond he hadn't spoken to in 4 years who owed him a debt that had nothing to do with motorcycles and everything to do with a night in 2019 that neither of them ever talked about. But before he made the first call, he sat alone in the chapel for 30 seconds and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The betrayal. The exposure. The knowledge that a 12-year-old girl's life now depended on his ability to rebuild an entire security apparatus in less than 24 hours, while a professional fixer with military training was already on his way. He looked at Ava's photographs on the wall. Grainy, imperfect, devastating. The girl who noticed everything, the girl whose father saved his life, the girl who was now the target of a man who made targets disappear. Stone Mercer picked up the phone and started dialing. His hands were steady, his voice was clear. And somewhere behind the scar tissue and the silence and the architecture of damage that held him together, something ancient and unbreakable, something that predated the war, predated the club, predated everything he'd built on top of the ruins of who he used to be, locked into place with the finality of a round being chambered. He would not lose her. Not this time. Not this debt. Not while he was still breathing. And 43 miles south on Interstate 81, a gray pickup truck with Virginia plates and no distinguishing features merged into the right lane at exactly the speed limit. The driver was clean-shaven, unremarkable, wearing a canvas jacket and work boots that could belong to any tradesman on any highway in America. His hands rested on the wheel at 10 and 2. His eyes watched the road with the patient, predatory focus of a man who had done this kind of work before and understood that the key to making problems disappear was never speed, it was precision. Garrett Price checked his mirrors, adjusted his grip, and drove north toward Millbrook with the unhurried certainty of weather moving toward a coastline. Inevitable, indifferent, and impossible to negotiate with. Garrett Price arrived in Millbrook at 9:47 on a Wednesday evening and checked into a motel called the Pinecrest 6 miles east of town. He paid cash. He used an ID that belonged to a man who'd been dead for 3 years. He carried one bag into the room, canvas, military surplus, heavy in a way that suggested the contents weren't clothing. He set the bag on the bed, drew the curtains, and sat in the dark for 40 minutes without moving. He was not thinking. He was calibrating. Price had done this 11 times, 11 problems in 6 states over 4 years. Each one resolved quietly, each one untraceable. He didn't rush, he didn't improvise. He studied the environment the way a surgeon studies a body before the first incision. Every variable accounted for, every contingency mapped, every exit route confirmed before the work began. He opened the canvas bag. Inside, a Sig Sauer P226 with a threaded barrel, a suppressor wrapped in a shop rag, a burner phone with one number stored, a set of lockpick tools in a leather roll, a pair of black nitrile gloves, a change of clothes sealed in a plastic bag. Nothing else. He assembled the suppressor, threaded it onto the barrel, set the weapon on the nightstand beside the bed, took out the burner phone and dialed. 1 ring, 2. The voice that answered was nervous. He found out about Davis. It was a voice from inside the network, not a club member, but an associate who worked at the check cashing service in Roanoke and had been feeding Price information for the past 3 weeks. They stripped his patches, dumped him at the state line. I know. They're reconfiguring the whole protection setup, new positions, outside riders. The girl hasn't left the house in 2 days. I know that too. So what's the play? Price looked at the weapon on the nightstand. The suppressor added 4 inches to the barrel and changed the silhouette into something that didn't look like a gun anymore. It looked like a tool, which is what it was. The play is the same. It's always the same. You wait until the wall has a crack, then you walk through it. He hung up, set the phone next to the weapon, laid down on the bed fully clothed and closed his eyes. Not to sleep. To wait. 8 miles northwest, Stone Mercer stood in the Iron King's garage at 10 o'clock at night, surrounded by 11 men and a map that had been redrawn so many times the paper was starting to tear at the fold lines. The overhead fluorescent hummed. Rain streaked the windows. Coffee sat cold in cups on every surface. The air smelled like leather and anxiety and the metallic tang of men operating under sustained pressure. The new protection plan had taken 18 hours to build. Colt had designed it like a military operation, which, at this point, it essentially was. 3 concentric rings around the Hargrove residence. Inner ring. 2 allied riders from the broken chains positioned at rotating locations within visual range of the house. Middle ring. 3 Iron King's members covering a 4-block perimeter with overlapping sightlines. Outer ring. Mobile patrols by riders from 2 additional clubs, running randomized routes that changed every 3 hours. No schedule was written down. No communication went through phones. Every rotation change was delivered in person by a courier who memorized the information and repeated it once. Blackout protocol. The way it was done before technology made people lazy and leaks made people dead. She's locked down, Colt said, tapping the map with his prosthetic finger, the metal clicking against the paper. 2 days inside. Sarah's got her, curtains drawn, routine disrupted. How's the girl handling it? Stone asked. Sarah says she's angry, wants to know why she can't go to school, wants to know why she can't go to Dell's, asking questions neither of them can answer. Stone rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. He hadn't slept in 31 hours. The exhaustion wasn't in his muscles. It was in his decision-making, in the edges of his thoughts where clarity started to blur and doubt started to creep in like water through cracks in a foundation. She's 12. She's going to push. She already pushed. Sarah caught her trying to sneak out the back door this afternoon with the camera, had to physically block the door. Something in Stone's chest contracted. Not anger. Recognition. The specific, painful recognition of a trait he'd seen before. In soldiers who couldn't stand being pulled off the line, in operators who needed to be in the field because sitting still felt like dying. Ava Hargrove was her father's daughter in ways that went deeper than genetics. I need to talk to her, Stone said. To the girl? She needs to understand what's happening. Not everything, but enough to know that staying inside isn't punishment. It's survival. Dutch looked up from the corner where he'd been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. You sure that's smart? Telling a 12-year-old that a professional is coming for her? I'm not going to tell her that. I'm going to tell her that the photographs she took are still helping people, and that the best thing she can do right now is stay safe so she can keep helping. You're going to lie to her. I'm going to give her a version of the truth that doesn't destroy her. Stone looked at Dutch. You got a better idea? Dutch didn't. Nobody did. At 10:30, Stone rode to the Hargrove house. No cut, plain jacket. He parked 2 blocks away and walked through the rain with his collar up and his boots splashing through puddles that reflected the yellow glow of streetlights in fractured patterns. Mac, the broken chains rider, flashed his headlights once from a truck across the street. All clear. Stone knocked. Sarah opened the door in sweats and bare feet, her face carrying the specific pallor of a woman who hadn't been sleeping because sleep required a level of safety she no longer felt. She's in her room. Can I talk to her? Sarah studied him, the scar, the eyes, the bearing of a man who looked like he'd been carrying weight for so long his skeleton had reshaped itself to accommodate the load. 5 minutes, and I'm standing in the hallway. Fair enough. Stone walked through the small house, clean but tired, the kind of clean that comes from discipline, not energy. A kitchen with dishes in the drying rack, a living room with a couch that sagged in the middle, a hallway with 3 doors, bathroom, Sarah's room, and at the end, Ava's. The 4th door was closed, David's room. Stone slowed as he passed it. Through the thin wood, he could hear the faint creak of a chair, the rhythmic, barely perceptible sound of someone rocking in place. Back and forth, back and forth. The metronome of a mind that had lost its way and was searching for a rhythm it could no longer find. Stone stopped. His hand hovered over the doorknob. His fingers trembled. The only part of his body that had trembled in 9 years. David Hargrove was on the other side of that door. The man who dragged him through fire. The man whose hands had kept him alive. The man who was now trapped inside a body that had survived the blast, but lost something the metals couldn't measure. Stone's hand dropped. Not yet. Not tonight. He walked to Ava's door, knocked once. Go away, Mom. It's not your mom. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened 3 inches. Ava's face appeared in the gap. Sharp eyes, tight jaw, the expression of someone whose patience had reached its structural limit. You're the biker. Stone. I know your name. She opened the door wider. She was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt too big for her. Probably her father's. And the camera hung around her neck even indoors, as if removing it would mean removing a limb. You're the reason I'm trapped in this house. I'm the reason you're safe in this house. Same thing. Stone almost smiled. The scar made it invisible. Can I come in? Ava stepped aside. The room was small, bed against the wall, desk covered in photographs, a line of film canisters arranged by date. The walls were covered with prints, street scenes, parking lots, reflections, shadows. The room of someone who processed the world through a lens because looking at it directly was too much. Stone stood in the center of the room and felt the weight of every photograph on every wall pressing against him like evidence. Your pictures helped people, Ava. The ones you gave me. Clubs in 5 states are safer because of what you documented. I know. You told me. What I didn't tell you is that the people you photographed are still out there, and they're angry, and they're looking for the person who exposed them. Ava's expression didn't change, but her hand moved to the camera strap. A micro gesture. The instinctive reach for the object that made her feel in control. They're looking for me. It wasn't a question. Stone realized with a sinking feeling that she'd already figured it out. Probably figured it out the moment her mother locked the door and drew the curtains and stopped explaining why. Yes. And you're protecting me. Yes. The men in the trucks, the ones who think I don't notice them. They're yours. Stone looked at her. The 12-year-old girl who noticed everything, who'd been sitting in her room for 2 days cataloging the protection detail the same way she'd cataloged the van, patiently, methodically, missing nothing. How many did you count? 3 during the day, 2 at night, different trucks, different spots, but the same pattern. They rotate every 8 hours. Stone exhaled, something between admiration and exhaustion. You're going to be a problem when you grow up. You know that? I'm a problem now. No smile, no humor. Just the flat statement of a kid who understood her own capability with the clarity that comes from having no one to lie to her about it. I need you to stay inside. Not because I'm trying to control you, because there's a man coming here whose job is to make problems disappear. And right now, you're the problem he's been hired to fix. I can protect you. My club can protect you, but I can't protect you if you're on the street with a camera at 3:30 in the afternoon. Ava's grip on the camera strap tightened. Her knuckles whitened. How long? Days? Maybe less? We're working on ending this. How? That's not your concern. It became my concern when I walked through your gate. Stone looked at this girl, this impossible, stubborn, perceptive, fearless girl who carried her dead-alive father's camera like a weapon and saw the world in patterns that adults missed, and felt the debt in his chest pulse like a second heartbeat. A few more days, Ava. That's all I'm asking. Stay inside, stay safe. Let us do what we do. Ava looked at the photographs on her wall. Her eyes moved across them the way Stone's eyes had moved across her surveillance photos. Reading, processing, understanding. My dad used to say that the people who pay attention are the ones who keep everyone else alive. Your dad was right. He also said that paying attention doesn't mean anything if you don't act on what you see. Stone said nothing. Because there was nothing to say to a child quoting her father's words back at him that didn't feel like an insult to the man sitting in the dark 3 doors away. "Stay inside, Ava. Please." The please cracked something. Not in her face, she was too controlled for that, but in her posture. The slight softening of shoulders that had been braced for a fight. "Fine. But when this is over, you owe me an explanation. All of it." "Deal." Stone walked out of the room. In the hallway, Sarah stood with her arms crossed, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "She's going to figure out more than you want her to," Sarah whispered. "She already has." Stone left the house. The rain had stopped, but the air was wet and heavy, and cold in the way that only January air in Virginia could be cold. Not the dramatic cold of northern winters, but the insidious, bone-deep cold that worked its way inside you and stayed. He was 3 steps from the sidewalk when his phone buzzed. Colt. "We've got movement." Stone's body went rigid. "Where?" "Pinecrest Motel, 6 miles east. Mac followed a gray pickup truck from the highway to the motel 2 hours ago. 1 occupant, canvas bag, paid cash." "Price?" "Has to be." Stone stood in the dark street with the phone against his ear and the wet pavement gleaming around his boots, and the sound of his own heartbeat filling the silence between Colt's words. "How many men do we have mobile right now?" 7, plus the protection detail. "Pull 3 from the outer ring. Keep the inner and middle intact. Nobody moves from the house. The girl stays covered no matter what." "And the 3 you're pulling?" "Send them to the Pinecrest, not inside. Perimeter only. I want eyes on that truck. I want to know when he leaves, which direction, and how fast." "Stone." Colt's voice carried the careful weight of a man about to say something his commanding officer might not want to hear. "If we pull 3 from the outer ring, we lose the randomized patrol routes. The outer perimeter goes dark." "I know." "That's the early warning system. If Price approaches from a direction we haven't covered—" "I know, Colt." Silence. The sound of the prosthetic clicking. The sound of a man calculating risks he couldn't eliminate. "Your call, brother." "It's already made." Stone rode back to the clubhouse through streets that were empty and wet and lit by streetlights that cast long shadows across pavement that looked like dark water. The Harley's engine echoed off the brick buildings of the east side, the sound bouncing and multiplying until it seemed like a dozen bikes were riding through the night instead of one. At the clubhouse, he found Dutch in the garage, standing over the Heritage Softail that still hadn't been repaired. The older man had a wrench in his hand but wasn't using it. He was staring at the engine the way people stare at things when they're actually looking at something else entirely. "He's here," Stone said. Dutch set the wrench down. "Price?" "Pinecrest Motel, 6 miles out." Dutch's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck corded. "Tonight?" "Not tonight. He'll watch first. That's how they work. Surveillance before action. Same pattern the theft crew used. Same discipline." "How long will he watch?" "A day, maybe 2. He'll map the protection detail, find the gap, and move through it." Stone pulled off his jacket and hung it on a hook by the door. His thermal underneath was damp with rain and sweat. "Except there isn't going to be a gap, because we're going to give him one." Dutch frowned. "Give him one?" "A false gap. A hole in the perimeter that looks real but leads nowhere. We pull the middle ring back at a specific time on a specific route and make it look like a shift change error. He'll see it. He'll move through it. And when he does, we close behind him." Dutch stared at Stone for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Water dripped from the roll-up door onto the concrete. "That's a trap." "That's the idea." "And if he doesn't take the bait?" "Then we wait, and we keep waiting, and we keep the girl locked down until he either moves or the police catch up." Stone pulled a cigarette from Dutch's pack on the workbench, lit it, drew deeply. "But he'll take it. Men like Price don't have patience for waiting. They have discipline for timing. There's a difference. Patience means you can walk away. Discipline means you can't. He's here because he has a job and he won't leave until it's done." "You sound like you know him." "I know the type. I was the type. Before." Dutch didn't ask before what. He didn't need to. Thursday, the longest day of Stone Mercer's life since Kandahar. The 3 riders at the Pinecrest reported that Price left the motel at 6:15 in the morning, drove a slow loop around Millbrook's east side, passed the Hargrove house twice without stopping, and returned to the motel by 8:30. He left again at noon, drove a wider loop that included the school and Dell's convenience store, and returned by 2. At 4, he made a third circuit, this one tighter, focused on the streets immediately surrounding the Hargrove residence. He was mapping the protection detail, exactly as Stone predicted. At 6 o'clock, Stone convened the inner circle in the chapel: Colt, Dutch, Briggs, Knox, and Mack from the broken chains. 6 men around the table, the overhead light casting sharp shadows. No coffee this time. No cigarettes. Just the map and the plan and the weight of what they were about to do. "Tomorrow night," Stone said, "between midnight and 2. That's when we create the gap." He outlined the operation with the precision of a military briefing. At 11:45, the middle ring would begin a staged rotation. 2 riders would pull back along a route that left the eastern approach to the Hargrove house visually uncovered for exactly 12 minutes. During that window, Price, if he was watching, and Stone was certain he would be watching, would see what appeared to be a shift change error, an opening. The opening would lead to a narrow street that ran between 2 rows of houses and dead-ended at a chain-link fence behind an abandoned lot. On both sides of that street, hidden in driveways and behind parked cars, Iron Kings and allied riders would be waiting. "He walks in," Stone said. "He doesn't walk out, not the same way." Briggs shifted in his chair. His dissent from the previous vote still hung in the air like old smoke, but his eyes were sharp and focused, and his objections had evolved from strategic to tactical. What if he doesn't come on foot? What if he drives? The street's too narrow for a vehicle to turn around. If he drives in, he's boxed. And if he comes armed? He will come armed. That's why there will be 8 of us and 1 of him. Stone looked at each man in turn. "Nobody engages until I give the signal. Nobody speaks. Nobody moves. We let him come all the way in, all the way to the dead end. And then we show ourselves." "And then what?" Knox's voice was quiet, careful. The voice of a man who wanted to know exactly how far this was going to go. Stone met his eyes. "Then we give him a choice. Walk away from Millbrook forever, or don't walk away at all." The room was silent. The map lay on the table between them like a battlefield. The overhead light flickered once. "I won't pretend this isn't dangerous," Stone continued. "Price is trained. He's experienced. He's done this before. But he's done it against civilians, against people who don't fight back. He hasn't done it against a room full of combat veterans who've already decided that losing isn't an option." Max spoke for the first time since he'd arrived from Tennessee. His voice carried the slow, deliberate cadence of the mountains, each word placed like a stone in a wall. "The girl, what happens to her during the operation?" "The inner ring stays on the house, 2 men, doors locked, Sarah and Ava inside. No matter what happens on that street, the house doesn't get exposed." "And if something goes wrong, if he gets past us?" Stone's expression changed. It was a subtle shift, the tightening of the jaw, the narrowing of the eyes, the almost imperceptible squaring of the shoulders, but every man in the room recognized it. It was the expression of a man who had already answered that question in a place deeper than language. "Nothing gets past us." Friday. The air temperature dropped to 19 degrees, the sky was clear for the first time in a week, and the stars above Millbrook were visible in the way that stars are only visible in small towns where the light pollution hasn't erased the sky. Stone spent the day in the garage, not planning, not strategizing, working. He finally fixed the Heritage Softail, the one that had been sitting on the lift since the day Ava walked in. He replaced the gasket, rebuilt the carburetor, adjusted the timing chain, tightened everything that needed tightening. The mechanical work steadied his hands and cleared his mind the way nothing else could. At 8 o'clock, he called Sarah. "Keep her in the back bedroom tonight, away from the front windows. Keep the lights off after 10. "What's happening?" "We're ending this." Sarah was quiet for 4 seconds. "Will she be safe?" "On my life." The words came out before Stone could consider them. And he realized, with the clarity that sometimes arrives only at the edge of action, that he meant them literally, not as a figure of speech, not as reassurance, as a contract on his life. At 10 o'clock, the riders took their positions, 2 by 2, in the dark, without headlights, without sound. They parked in driveways and behind dumpsters, and in the shadows of houses where the streetlights didn't reach. 8 men in a 4-block radius, arranged in a configuration that looked like nothing from the outside and looked like a closed fist from above. Stone took his position at the dead end of the narrow street, behind the chain-link fence, in the shadow of a garage that hadn't been used in years. The cold was severe. His breath formed clouds that dissolved into the dark. His hands were in his jacket pockets. He carried no weapon. He'd made that decision deliberately, not from principle, but from calculation. If this went wrong and police arrived, the man without a weapon was the man with options. Colt was 30 yards south in a driveway, his prosthetic hand resting on his thigh. Dutch was 20 yards north behind a parked pickup truck. Briggs was across the street in a gap between 2 houses that was barely wide enough for his shoulders. The others were spread along the street at intervals that covered every angle, every approach, every possible line of retreat. At 11:45, the middle ring executed the staged rotation. The 2 riders pulled back along the designated route, leaving the eastern approach visually uncovered. From any surveillance position overlooking the Hargrove house, it would look like a timing error, a gap, a mistake. The gap would remain open for 12 minutes, then close. Stone watched the seconds pass on a wristwatch he'd borrowed from Dutch. Analog, no illumination, the ticking barely audible above the sound of his own breathing. 11:50. The street was empty. The cold was absolute. 11:55. Nothing. A dog barked somewhere distant. A car passed on the main road 2 blocks south. The sound faded. Midnight. Stone's heartbeat was 52 beats per minute. He'd counted, the same rate he'd maintained during operations in Kandahar, the body's way of conserving energy for the moment when everything would accelerate. 12:03. A figure appeared at the east end of the street, on foot, moving along the left side close to the fence line, using the shadows the way someone trained in movement uses shadows. Not hiding in them, but flowing through them, becoming part of the dark the way water becomes part of the ground it covers. The figure wore dark clothing, canvas jacket, the outline of something held low against the right thigh, a bag over the left shoulder, moving with the controlled pace of someone who had identified the gap and was now exploiting it with the mechanical efficiency of a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed in his mind 100 times. Garrett Price. Stone's breath slowed, his vision sharpened. The edges of the world became precise, in the way they only became precise during moments when everything depended on timing and silence and the willingness to commit to an action that couldn't be taken back. Price moved down the street, past the first driveway where Colt sat motionless in the dark, past the gap between houses where Briggs pressed his back against the siding and held his breath, past Dutch's position behind the pickup truck, deeper, deeper into the street, deeper into the trap. He was 40 yards from the dead end when he slowed. Something shifted in his posture, a slight rotation of the shoulders, a tilt of the head, the subtle body language of someone whose instincts were sending a signal that his discipline was telling him to override. Stone watched from behind the fence. His hands were out of his pockets now, flat against his thighs. Ready. Price stopped. He stood in the middle of the narrow street with the dead end ahead, and the shadows behind, and the absolute silence of a neighborhood that was holding its breath. Then Stone stepped out from behind the fence. He walked to the center of the street. His boots on the cold pavement made a sound that carried in the frozen air like a heartbeat. He stopped 15 yards from Price. They looked at each other across the dark. Then Colt stepped out of the driveway, and Dutch stepped out from behind the truck, and Briggs emerged from the gap between houses, and Mac appeared from a shadow that hadn't seemed large enough to conceal a man his size, and 3 more riders materialized from positions along the street like figures emerging from a photograph, suddenly visible, suddenly real, suddenly everywhere. 8 men, 1 street, no exit. Price didn't run. He didn't reach for the object against his thigh. He stood perfectly still and assessed the geometry of the situation with the detached professionalism of someone calculating odds, not out of fear, but out of habit. Garrett Price. Stone's voice filled the street, flat, even. The voice of a man who had rehearsed nothing because preparation was unnecessary when the truth was sufficient. You're standing on ground, protected by men who don't lose. You were sent here to make a 12-year-old girl disappear because she had the courage to photograph the people robbing our brothers. And you took the job because someone offered you money, and you stopped caring about what the money cost a long time ago. Price said nothing. His eyes moved across the men surrounding him, counting, measuring. His breath formed clouds in the frozen air. Here's what happens now. Stone took one step forward. The distance between them closed to 12 yards. You turn around. You walk back to the Pinecrest. You pack your bag. You drive south on I-81, and you don't stop until Virginia's in your rearview mirror. You tell whoever hired you that the source is protected, that Millbrook is closed, that if anyone comes near that girl or her family again, the next conversation won't happen on a street. It'll happen somewhere no one will find either of us. Price exhaled slowly. The cloud of breath hung in front of his face like a veil. And if I don't? Then you're standing in a dead-end street with 8 men who've already decided how this ends. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight and density. The kind you can feel pressing against your chest. Price looked at Stone. Really looked at him. Not at the scars or the size or the threat. At the eyes. At what lived behind them. You'd go this far for a kid? I'd go further. She's not yours. She is now. The words hung in the air between them like a verdict. And something in Price's calculation shifted, not toward fear because men like Price had cauterized that circuit a long time ago, but toward recognition. The recognition that the man standing in front of him wasn't bluffing because bluffing required the willingness to fold, and the expression on Stone Mercer's scarred face contained no fold, no retreat, no negotiation, just the absolute bedrock certainty of a man who had already decided that losing this girl was not a possible outcome of this night. Price's hand moved slowly away from his thigh. He unshouldered the bag, set it on the ground, stepped back. The people I work for don't stop because someone tells them to. Then they'll send someone else, and we'll be here for that too. You can't protect her forever. Watch me. Price stood in the frozen street for 7 more seconds. His eyes swept the perimeter one final time. Then he turned, walked back the way he'd come, and disappeared into the dark at the end of the block. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The street held its shape like a clenched fist refusing to open. Then Colt's phone vibrated. He answered, listened. His face went white in the dark. Stone. What? The inner ring, the 2 men on the Hargrove house. Colt's voice cracked. The first time Stone had ever heard it crack. They're not responding. The street detonated into motion. Stone was running before the last word left Colt's mouth. His boots hammered the frozen pavement. The cold air burned his lungs. Behind him, the sound of 7 men breaking into a sprint, boots and breathing, and the raw animal urgency of people who understood that 12 minutes was enough time to create a gap, and a gap was enough time for a man like Price to have a contingency plan. Because Price hadn't come alone. Stone rounded the corner onto the Hargrove street and saw the front door of the house standing open. The porch light was out. The inner ring rider's truck was still parked across the street, but the cab was empty and the driver's side door was open and the dome light cast a thin yellow glow across the wet pavement. Stone hit the porch steps at a full run. The door swung wide as he crashed through it. The hallway was dark. The kitchen was dark. The living room was dark. From the back of the house, a sound. Not a scream. Something worse. The low, guttural, primal sound of a mother placing her body between her child and the dark, and the sharp crack of a voice saying, "Nobody move!" Stone froze in the hallway, his eyes adjusted. The back bedroom door was open. Inside, a man stood with his back to the window. Medium build, dark clothes, gloves. He had Sarah by the arm. Ava was behind her mother, pressed against the wall, the camera clutched against her chest like a shield. The man wasn't Price. He was younger, leaner. One of the theft crew, a cleanup detail sent through the real gap, while Price walked through the false one. A decoy and an operator. The oldest trick in the book, and Stone had fallen for it. Let them go. Stone's voice came from somewhere deep and ancient, not his chest, not his throat. From the place where the war lived, where the fire lived, where the 40-meter drag through Kandahar dust and blood had etched a debt into his bones that would not be settled until the people in this room were safe. The man's grip tightened on Sarah's arm. She didn't cry out. Her jaw was clenched so hard the tendons in her neck stood out like cables. Her eyes found Stone's in the dark. Behind Stone, Boots in the hallway. Colt. Dutch. Bodies filling the space. The house suddenly full of men who smelled like cold air and adrenaline and the specific chemical scent of fear converting into action. And then from the dark room at the end of the hall, the room with the closed door, the room with the creaking chair, the room everyone had walked past for months without stopping. A sound. A doorknob turning. A door opening. A figure stepping into the hallway. David Hargrove stood in the dark, gaunt, unsteady. His eyes carrying the fractured, thousand-yard focus of a man whose mind had been broken and rebuilt so many times the architecture no longer resembled anything recognizable. He wore a white t-shirt and pajama pants, and his feet were bare on the cold hardwood floor. He looked at Stone, and for the first time in 9 years, the fog behind David Hargrove's eyes cleared. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Enough to see the scar. Enough to recognize the face beneath the damage. Enough for his cracked lips to form a single word that landed in the hallway like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Mercer? The word hit Stone like a round to the chest. Not the sound of it. The recognition behind it. The voice of a man who hadn't spoken a coherent word in months, forming the one name that lived deeper than the damage, buried beneath the shattered architecture of a brain that had been rebuilt by blast waves and rebuilt wrong, stored in the part of memory that trauma couldn't reach because it was welded to survival itself. Mercer. David Hargrove stood in the hallway with his bare feet on the cold hardwood and his eyes locked on Stone's face with an intensity that didn't belong to the man his family had been living with for the past 2 years. This was something older, something that predated the injury, predated the silence, predated the chair by the window, and the 1,000-yard stare, and the slow erosion of everything that had once made him a father and a husband and a soldier. This was the man who had dragged a burning sergeant 40 meters through gunfire. This was the man whose hands remembered what his mind had forgotten. In the back bedroom, the intruder's grip on Sarah's arm loosened by a fraction. Not from fear, from confusion. The hallway was suddenly full of variables he hadn't planned for. The scarred biker frozen 3 feet away. The gaunt man in the white t-shirt who'd materialized from a closed room like something summoned, the sound of more boots behind them, the geometry of the situation collapsing from manageable into chaos. David took a step forward, then another. His movement was unsteady. The gait of a man whose body had been sitting for so long the muscles had atrophied and the neural pathways had silted up like unused roads. But his eyes were clear. Clearer than they'd been in 23 months. "That's my daughter," David said. His voice was rust and gravel, the voice of an engine that hadn't turned over in years finally catching. "You're standing in my house with my daughter." The intruder looked at David, then at Stone, then at the hallway behind Stone where Colt's silhouette filled the frame and Dutch's shadow moved against the wall like something massive and patient. The math was over. Whatever equation the man had been running, get the camera, get the photos, get the girl, get out, no longer computed. The variables had multiplied beyond solution. He was one man in a house that now contained 5, and the one in the hallway with the bare feet and the broken brain was looking at him with the expression of a father whose body had remembered what fatherhood meant before his mind could catch up. David Hargrove didn't shout, didn't charge. He walked forward with the slow, deliberate certainty of someone operating on the deepest possible level of instinct. The level where a parent's body moves toward threat the way water moves downhill, without decision, without thought, because the physics of protection don't require consciousness. The intruder released Sarah's arm. He stepped back toward the window. His hand went to his jacket, reaching for something, a weapon, a phone, an exit strategy. And Stone moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just the efficient, practiced closure of distance that a decade of combat had trained into his muscle memory. 3 steps. His hand closed around the man's wrist before the hand reached the jacket. His other hand pressed flat against the man's chest and drove him backward against the wall with a force that cracked the drywall and sent a picture frame crashing to the floor. The man's head struck the plaster. His eyes lost focus. Stone held him there, pinned, immobilized, the wrist twisted at an angle that made reaching for anything impossible, and waited. Colt appeared in the bedroom doorway. He looked at the scene, assessed it, moved to Sarah and Ava with the controlled urgency of someone trained in casualty assessment. His prosthetic hand touched Sarah's shoulder. His real hand reached for Ava. "You're safe," Colt said. "It's done. You're safe." Sarah's legs gave out. Not dramatically. She didn't collapse or fall. She simply stopped standing, her body folded onto the edge of the bed with the controlled descent of someone whose structural integrity had finally reached its limit. She pulled Ava against her chest with both arms and held on with the force of a woman who had just watched the worst possible thing almost happen to the only thing in her life that still mattered. Ava didn't cry. Her eyes were open, wide, fixed on Stone's back as he held the man against the wall. The camera was still clutched against her chest. Her knuckles were white around it. Behind them all, David Hargrove stood in the doorway. His hands were trembling. His eyes were wet. He was looking at his daughter with an expression that contained everything the TBI had taken from him. Love, recognition, terror, guilt. The specific agony of a father who had been absent inside his own house for 2 years and had chosen this moment, this impossible moment, to come back. "Ava." His voice broke on the second syllable, cracked open like something that had been sealed too long and couldn't contain itself anymore. Ava's head turned. She looked at her father, and for the first time since Stone had met her, for the first time in longer than anyone in the room could measure, the stillness that defined Ava Hargrove shattered. Her face crumpled, not into tears, into something rawer. The involuntary collapse of a child who had spent 2 years being strong because nobody told her she was allowed to stop. "Dad?" The single syllable carried more weight than every word spoken in this house for 23 months combined. David crossed the room, his bare feet on the floor, his thin arms reaching. He knelt beside the bed and pulled his daughter into an embrace that was clumsy and shaking and incomplete. The embrace of a man whose body was relearning movements his mind had stored in a place the blast couldn't reach. Sarah's hand found his shoulder. The three of them held on to each other in the dark bedroom while the cold pressed against the windows, and the sounds of boots and voices filled the hallway, and somewhere outside, the distant rumble of a Harley engine broke the silence like the first sound after a long, terrible quiet. Stone handed the intruder to Dutch and Colt, who moved the man through the house and out the front door with the efficient silence of men who'd handled worse. On the porch, Mac and Briggs were already waiting. The intruder was placed in the back of a truck. No violence, no theatrics, just containment. He'd be delivered to the county sheriff's office with an anonymous package containing everything the Iron Kings had compiled: the surveillance photos, the plate numbers, the shell company documentation, the financial trail linking the theft ring to operations across 5 states, the kind of evidence package that made a prosecutor's career and an arrest record that stuck. Price was already gone. Mac's riders tracked the gray pickup south on I-81. It crossed the state line at 3:14 in the morning and kept going. By dawn, it had passed through North Carolina and was still moving south. The message had been received, not through words, through the geometry of 8 men standing in a dead-end street with expressions that left no room for misinterpretation. Stone stood on the Hargrove porch at 4 in the morning. The cold was absolute. His breath hung in the air like smoke. His hands rested on the porch railing, and his eyes looked out at the dark street where the protection detail was still in place. Mac in the truck, a broken chains rider in the driveway across the street, the middle ring holding its positions with the discipline of men who wouldn't stand down until they received the order. The front door opened behind him. Sarah stepped out. She'd put on a coat and boots, but her hair was still loose, and her face still carried the aftermath of everything that had happened. Not shell shock, exactly, but the specific exhaustion of a person whose adrenaline had sustained them through a crisis and then withdrawn all at once, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own nervous system. She stood beside Stone at the railing. Neither of them spoke for a full minute. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had passed through something together and didn't need language to acknowledge it. "He spoke," Sarah said finally. Her voice was quiet, stripped. The voice of someone still processing something they'd witnessed but couldn't yet explain. "David, he spoke. He said her name. I heard. He hasn't said her name in 11 months. Stone's hands tightened on the railing. The cold metal bit into his palms. "Sometimes the mind protects itself by shutting down," he said. "And sometimes, when the threat is real enough, it overrides the shutdown, because protecting someone else matters more than protecting itself." Sarah turned and looked at him. In the dim light, her eyes searched his scarred face the way they'd searched it the first time he stood on this porch, looking for deception, manipulation, danger. But this time, she was looking for something else: understanding. The specific understanding that only comes from people who've been damaged in similar ways. "You knew his name. Before any of this, you knew the name Hargrove." Stone exhaled. The breath cloud dissolved into the dark. "Your husband saved my life, Kandahar province. 9 years ago. An IED took out the lead vehicle in our convoy. I was in the second vehicle. The blast caught the left side of my face." He touched the scar. The gesture was unconscious, the involuntary mapping of damage that had become so familiar it was landscape rather than wound. "David pulled me out, dragged me 40 meters under fire, applied a tourniquet to my leg with his own hands while he was bleeding from his own shrapnel wounds. He stayed with me until the medevac arrived, talked to me the entire time. About you. About the baby you were expecting, about a camera he wanted to buy." Sarah's hand went to her mouth. The same gesture she'd made the first time he told her Ava was in danger. The body's way of containing something the voice couldn't carry. "He never told me the names," she whispered. "He came home, and he never talked about any of it. Not the missions, not the people, nothing. Most of us don't. It's not secrecy, it's survival. You put the names in a box, and you close the box and you don't open it. Because opening it means reliving it. And reliving it means feeling it. And feeling it means—" Stone stopped. His jaw worked. The scar pulled. "It means the war never ends." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "So you came here because of him, because of the debt." "I came here because your daughter walked into my clubhouse and did the right thing. I stayed because of the debt, and I'll keep coming back because—" He paused, chose his next words the way a man chooses his footing on unstable ground. "Because some things aren't debts. They're just what you do. David would have done it for my daughter, if I had one. If things had been different." Sarah put her hand on Stone's arm. The touch was brief, light, not intimate, something more fundamental than intimacy. The contact of one human being telling another that they had been seen and that what was seen was enough. "Thank you," she said, "for my daughter, for tonight, for all of it." Stone nodded, once. The nod of a man who didn't know how to receive gratitude because he'd spent his life in places where gratitude was a luxury and survival was the only currency. Sarah went back inside. Stone stood on the porch for another 10 minutes, watching the street, feeling the cold, letting his heartbeat return to the 52 beats per minute that was his baseline. The steady metronome of a body that had survived everything the world had thrown at it and was still standing. The arrest started 3 days later. The evidence package delivered to the county sheriff's office triggered a multi-agency investigation that expanded faster than anyone anticipated. The shell companies, the forged registrations, the chop shop outside Roanoke, the financial trail connecting Garrett Price to the theft operation. Within a week, federal agents had executed warrants across 4 states. 14 individuals were arrested. 6 stolen motorcycles were recovered from a warehouse in southwestern Virginia. The laptop confiscated from the intruder captured at the Hargrove house contained Ava's home address, her school schedule, and a cache of surveillance photographs that corroborated every element of the Iron King's intelligence. The theft ring collapsed completely, not because of a massive law enforcement operation, because a 12-year-old girl with a broken camera had noticed a van circling a block and decided to do something about it. Ava returned to her routine on a Monday. School at 7:15, Dell's at 3:30, the curb, the coffee with too much sugar, the camera. the cracked lens still producing images that saw the world more clearly than most people ever would. But things were different now. The differences were small, the kind only someone who noticed everything would catch. The protection details scaled back over the following weeks. 2 men became 1. 1 became an occasional drive-by. The Broken Chains riders returned to Tennessee. The Allied clubs went home. The network that had assembled to protect 1 girl dispersed back into the lives and territories it had come from, carrying with it the knowledge that the system still worked. That the old ways, trust, loyalty, face-to-face, the willingness to show up when someone needed you, hadn't been replaced by technology or convenience. They'd just been waiting to be tested. Briggs never apologized for his dissenting vote. He didn't need to. The night of the operation, he'd been in the gap between 2 houses, pressed against the siding, ready to step into whatever came through that street. His objections had been strategic. His presence had been absolute. That was the difference between dissent and betrayal, and every man at the table understood it without it ever being spoken. The Heritage Softail stone had finally repaired sat in the garage, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Running. Restored. A machine that had been broken and fixed by hands that understood that damage wasn't the end of usefulness. It was the beginning of a different kind of strength. Spring arrived the way spring arrives in Virginia, not all at once, but in increments. A degree here, a bud there. The gradual softening of air that had been hard and cold for months. The days lengthened. The neon outside dells reflected in puddles that were rain now instead of ice. The exhaust from the Iron King's bikes carried through air that smelled like wet earth instead of frozen metal. The annual Iron King's family barbecue happened on the first Saturday in May. It was the one day each year when the clubhouse gates opened wide and the garage filled with people who weren't patched members. Wives, children, friends, allied riders. The extended constellation of lives that orbited the club without wearing its colors. Grills smoked in the parking lot. The smell of charcoal and grilled meat mixed with the permanent scent of engine oil and gasoline that no amount of cleaning could ever remove from the concrete. Music played from a speaker someone had propped on a workbench. Kids ran between the bikes, careful not to touch, the way children of bikers learn to move through the world their parents built, with respect for the machines and the men who rode them. Ava arrived at 4 o'clock. Sarah drove. David sat in the passenger seat. It was the first time David Hargrove had left the house in 14 months. He moved slowly, carefully. The way a man moves through a landscape he's not sure is real. His eyes swept the clubhouse lot with the wary vigilance of someone whose brain still processed the world as a series of potential threats. But beneath the vigilance, something else. Curiosity. The faint, tentative curiosity of a man rejoining a world he'd left behind. Sarah held his arm, not supporting him, steadying him. The way you steady a ship in a harbor, not because it can't float, but because the water is unfamiliar. Ava walked ahead, camera around her neck. She stepped through the gate, the same gate she'd pushed open on a freezing January night that felt like a different lifetime, and entered the world she'd accidentally changed. Stone saw her from across the lot. He was standing near the grill with Dutch, holding a plate he wasn't eating from, wearing a t-shirt that exposed the full geography of his arms. The scars, the tattoos, the ropey muscle built from years of riding and working and carrying weight that wasn't always physical. He set the plate down when he saw the Hargrove family come through the gate. Ava walked toward him. The late afternoon light caught the cracked lens of her camera and turned it into a small, imperfect star. "You owe me an explanation," she said. "All of it. That was the deal." That was the deal. So? Stone looked at her. This girl. This impossible, fearless, perceptive girl who had walked into a room full of dangerous men and refused to shrink, who had photographed a threat nobody else saw and carried the evidence to the only people she believed would act on it, who had survived the consequences of her own courage with a stillness that belonged to someone 3 times her age. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." Stone almost smiled. The scar made it difficult, but not impossible. For the first time in a long time, the expression reached past the damage. "That's going to take more than one barbecue." "I've got time." They sat down on this concrete apron outside the garage, away from the crowd, where the music was background noise and the late sun painted long golden shadows across the lot. Stone told her, "Not everything. Not the motel room, not Davis's betrayal, not the full extent of what Price had been sent to do, but the shape of it, the van, the network, the allied clubs that had responded, the riders who'd come from other states to watch over a girl they'd never met because the system of loyalty that held their world together demanded it." Ava listened. She didn't interrupt. She absorbed information the way she absorbed light through her camera, quietly, completely, missing nothing. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Her fingers rested on the camera body. The cracked lens caught the fading light. "All those people," she said finally, "all those clubs, because of some photographs. Because of the person who took them." Ava looked across the lot at her father. David was sitting in a folding chair near the grill. Colt was beside him, talking quietly, the prosthetic hand resting on the arm of his chair. David was listening, actually listening, his eyes tracking Colt's face, his head tilting slightly the way it used to tilt when he was engaged, when the world still reached him through channels that worked. Sarah stood nearby, watching her husband with the cautious, incredulous expression of someone witnessing something they'd stopped believing was possible. "He's better," Ava said. "Since that night. He's different." "How?" "He comes out of his room now, not every day, but sometimes. He sat at the kitchen table yesterday and watched me develop photos. Didn't say anything, but he watched." Her voice carried the careful restraint of someone describing something fragile, something that could break if handled with too much expectation. "He said my name again last week. Twice." Stone looked at David Hargrove across the lot, the gaunt man in the folding chair with the 1,000-yard stare that was slowly, incrementally, narrowing its focus from the infinite distance of trauma to the finite distance of the people around him. "Your dad saved my life," Stone said. "Kandahar, 9 years ago. He dragged me out of a burning vehicle and carried me 40 meters under fire. I wouldn't be here without him." Ava turned and looked at Stone. Her expression was unreadable at first, the composed, analytical stillness she defaulted to when processing something that mattered. Then it changed. A softening at the edges. Not vulnerability, exactly. Recognition. The recognition that the thread connecting her to this man and this place was older and deeper than she'd known. "That's why you did all this. The protection. The men outside our house, all of it. That's part of it. What's the other part?" Stone picked up a pebble from the concrete and turned it in his fingers. The stone was smooth from years of being walked on. "You reminded me of something I forgot. That paying attention matters, that showing up matters, that the people who see the things everyone else ignores are the ones who keep the rest of us alive." He set the pebble down. "Your father taught me that in Kandahar. You taught me again in January. Different war, same lesson." Ava was quiet. The golden light shifted. Shadows lengthened across the lot. The smell of grilled meat and gasoline drifted through the air, and the sound of the music and the voices blended into a texture that felt, for the first time in Ava's memory, like something she recognized as belonging. Stone reached into his pocket and took out a small object. Silver, the size of a quarter. He held it out on his open palm. An iron king's pin. The crowned skull over crossed wrenches, polished, new. Not a patch. Something smaller, quieter, personal. "This isn't for bravery," Stone said. "Bravery is what people call it when someone does something dangerous without thinking. You thought about it. You calculated the risk, and you walked through that gate anyway. That's not bravery. That's something harder, something rarer." Ava took the pin. She held it in her hand and looked at it the way she looked at everything, with the careful, searching attention of someone who understood that the surface of things was never the whole truth. "What is it, then?" "Paying attention, when everyone else looked away." Ava closed her hand around the pin. She didn't put it on. She held it. The way you hold something you intend to keep for a long time. The barbecue wound down as the sun dropped below the tree line and the air cooled from warm to pleasant to the first edge of evening chill. People drifted home in small groups. Engines started. Headlights swept across the lot. The sound of Harleys faded down the road in ones and twos, the rumble diminishing by degrees until the only engines left were the ones cooling in the lot, ticking quietly as the metal contracted. Stone found David near the garage. The older Hargrove had stood up from his chair and was looking at the row of motorcycles with the expression of a man studying a language he used to speak but hadn't practiced in years. His hands hung at his sides. His breathing was steady. Stone stood beside him. They looked at the bikes together. Neither spoke for a while. "You don't remember me," Stone said. Not a question. David's jaw moved. The muscles worked. His eyes, still carrying the fractured focus of the TBI, shifted from the bikes to Stone's face. Something moved behind them. Not the full clearing that had happened the night of the break-in, but a flicker. A pulse of connection in a system that was mostly dark. "Mercer," David said. The word came slowly, pulled from deep storage. "The convoy. Yeah. You were burning. Yeah." David's hand lifted, trembling. He touched his own chest near the shoulder, the spot where his own shrapnel wounds had left scars that mirrored Stone's, smaller and scattered. The constellation of damage from an explosion that had changed both their lives in different but equal ways. "I pulled you. 40 meters, under fire. You saved my life, David." David's hand dropped, his chin lowered. The trembling moved from his hands to his shoulders. Not cold, not fear. The seismic release of a memory resurfacing from beneath years of neural damage and practiced forgetting. A memory that was too heavy to carry and too important to lose. "I couldn't." His voice cracked, stalled, the words piling up behind a dam that the TBI had built, and his mind was slowly, painfully dismantling. "I couldn't remember. Any of it. The names, the faces. It was all, I know. I came home and I couldn't. I know, David." Stone put his hand on David Hargrove's shoulder. The touch was firm. Not gentle. Stone didn't do gentle. But steady. The pressure of one man telling another that the weight was shared. That the carrying wasn't solitary anymore. "Your daughter walked into my clubhouse and did exactly what you would have done," Stone said. "She saw something wrong. She paid attention. She acted. She's got everything you gave her, David. Everything." David looked across the lot. Ava was standing near the gate with Sarah, the camera hanging from her neck, the silver pin glinting in the last of the evening light. She was photographing the sunset, the way it hit the chrome of the bikes, the way it painted the garage door in colors that didn't exist at any other time of day. Something happened in David Hargrove's face, not the dramatic transformation of a man suddenly healed. The TBI didn't work that way. Recovery wasn't a light switch. It was a sunrise, slow, gradual, uneven, with setbacks and false starts and moments of darkness that made you doubt the light was coming at all. But something shifted, a fraction, a degree, the way a compass needle moves when it finally finds north after spinning for years. "Tell her," David said. His voice was rough, strained, but present. "Tell her I'm proud." "You tell her, when you're ready." David nodded. The motion was small, uncertain. The nod of a man who wasn't sure he'd be ready, but was willing, for the first time in 2 years, to believe that ready was something he might become. Stone turned and walked toward the gate, his boots on the concrete, his shadow stretching long behind him in the fading light. "Mercer?" Stone stopped. "Thank you. For watching her." Stone looked back over his shoulder. David Hargrove stood alone in the lot, surrounded by cooling motorcycles and the lingering smell of smoke and gasoline, a thin man in a borrowed jacket who had carried a wounded soldier 40 meters through fire and then spent 9 years forgetting everything except the instinct that made him do it. "Stone," he said. "It's Stone now. Stone from Kandahar." The words carried across the lot like something that had been waiting years to be said. A recognition, a closing of the circle. A debt acknowledged between two men who had bled in the same dust and found each other again through the courage of a child who noticed what the rest of the world ignored. "Stone from Kandahar," Stone repeated, "and the debt is paid." He walked through the gate. The evening air was cool and clean. The last light sat on the horizon like a thin gold line separating the earth from the dark. Behind him, the Iron King's clubhouse settled into silence. The grills cooled. The music stopped. The lot emptied until the only things left were the bikes and the building and the buzzing fluorescent lights that would still be on when the riders returned tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Back home, Ava placed the silver Iron King's pin on her desk beside the camera. The cracked lens and the polished metal sat side by side. The broken thing that still worked and the new thing that meant she belonged somewhere she hadn't expected. She developed the photographs from the barbecue that night. The images came up in the dark room the way they always did. Slowly, imperfectly, beautifully. Stone standing by the grill with the plate he wasn't eating. Colt's prosthetic hand resting on the arm of a chair, Dutch wiping oil from his fingers with a rag. Her father sitting in a folding chair with the first expression she'd seen on his face in 2 years that looked like it might, someday, become a smile. She pinned the photos to her wall alongside all the others. Street scenes and parking lots and stray cats and neon reflections and the ordinary, invisible, overlooked moments that nobody else thought mattered. But they did. They always had. Because Ava Hargrove understood something that most people spent their entire lives failing to learn, that the world reveals itself to the people who bother to look. Every month afterward, when the Iron Kings gathered beneath the garage lights for their regular meetings, a folding chair sat empty near the workbench. Not forgotten. Not misplaced. Placed deliberately. With the kind of intention that didn't need explanation because everyone who saw it understood what it meant. The chair was Ava's. It would be there whenever she came back, and she would come back. Not because she needed protection, not because she owed anyone anything, but because family is sometimes built not by blood or birth, but by the simple, radical act of showing up for someone when the rest of the world looks away. The camera sat on the desk. The pin sat beside it, and outside in the dark Virginia night, the distant sound of motorcycles rumbled through the cold air like a heartbeat, steady, persistent, unbreakable. The sound of men who had chosen to stand watch for people who couldn't stand watch for themselves. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, because it was the only thing worth doing.